Before the flood that drowned the world, there were cities whose foundations were laid by hands that were not entirely human. The oldest fragments speak of the Nephilim, beings born when the Watchers descended and bound themselves to the daughters of men. What followed was not merely intermingling, but the transmission of forbidden arts, metallurgy, astrology, warfare, and enchantments that had belonged only to heaven. These giants did not merely exist, they built, they ruled. They taught humanity secrets meant to remain sealed. The texts describe kingdoms where the architecture defied natural law, where knowledge flowed from angelic minds into mortal ambition. Yet the record grows quiet on certain details, how tall their towers truly rose, what rituals sustained their cities, why heaven watched in silence before the judgment fell. The Book of Enoch preserves fragments. Genesis offers a single verse. Later traditions whisper of names the canon chose not to preserve. What remains is a shadow cast across millennia, and the questions it raises have never been answered. The world was young when heaven's order was first broken, not by violence, not by cosmic rebellion in the manner of older wars, but by oath, deliberate binding spoken on a summit where the boundary between earth and sky felt thin. The Book of Enoch preserves the account. 200 angels, beings tasked with watching over the affairs of men, gathered on Mount Hermon in the days of Jard, father of Enoch. What they planned was not sudden passion but coordinated transgression. They knew what they intended. They understood the cost, and so they swore an oath together, binding themselves by mutual imprecations, curses that would fall upon any who abandoned the plan once begun. The leader among them was Semyaza, though later texts suggest tension in the hierarchy, as Azazel is also named as chief in certain passages. Beneath Semyaza stood 20 captains, each commanding 10 of the host, forming the total of 200 who descended. Their names are recorded: Uriel, Akibil, Tamiel, Ramuel, Danel, Askiel, Sarachniel, Asael, and others whose syllables carry the weight of roles now abandoned. These were not minor spirits. They were watchers, celestial beings whose function was observation, guardianship, perhaps intercession. The texts do not clarify their full original purpose, only that they left it. The oath they swore was essential. None could proceed alone. The act required collective resolve, shared guilt, mutual accountability. Enoch records their words: "Let us all swear an oath, and all bind ourselves by mutual imprecations not to abandon this plan but to do this thing." The mountain itself became the witness. Its name, Hermon, was understood in later tradition to derive from the Hebrew root related to oath, to binding, to that which is consecrated or forbidden. What they consecrated was their descent. What they forbade was their return. The object of their desire was explicit. They had seen the daughters of men, those born of Adam's line, mortal and fair, and found them beautiful. Genesis offers only a fragment. The sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. The canonical text is brief. The Book of Enoch expands it, framing the act not as sudden lust but as premeditated crossing of a boundary meant to remain inviolate. Angels were not meant to marry. The separation between heaven and earth was not merely spatial but ontological, different orders of being, different modes of existence. Yet the Watchers chose otherwise. They descended from their stations. The text does not describe how, whether they appeared as men, whether they materialized slowly or arrived in a single moment. What matters is that they came and they did not return. They took wives from among humanity, and those unions were consummated. The boundary was not merely approached, it was violated. The implications were immediate, though the consequences would unfold slowly. These were not marriages in the covenantal sense. The texts describe taking, choosing, selecting, language that suggests authority exercised over those without power to refuse. The daughters of men bore children, and those children were not human. Genesis names them Nephilim, a term scholars have long debated. Some derive it from the Hebrew root meaning to fall. others from a root meaning giant. The Book of Enoch is more direct. It describes the offspring as beings of enormous size whose appetites and capacities exceeded mortal limits. But the Watchers did more than sire giants. They taught. Azazel revealed the art of forging swords, crafting shields, fashioning ornaments and cosmetics. Semyaza instructed in pharmaceutical enchantments, the manipulation of roots and plants for purposes beyond healing. Others taught astrology, the reading of celestial signs, the observation of heavenly patterns that had been the domain of angelic knowledge alone. What had belonged to heaven now passed into human hands, and humanity was not prepared for it. The world began to change. Knowledge that should have unfolded gradually, if at all, arrived all at once. Warfare became more sophisticated. Vanity grew. The mysteries of the stars, which had guided the rhythms of planting and harvest, were twisted toward divination and manipulation. The natural order, already fragile, bent under the weight of what the Watchers had introduced. This was not progress. The texts frame it as corruption, the injection of something foreign into a system designed to function without it. Mount Hermon stood behind them, its peak a monument to the oath that could not be undone. The Watchers had bound themselves, and in binding themselves, they had bound the earth to consequences it had not chosen. Heaven watched. The record suggests silence, not approval. What the Watchers had sworn in defiance they would be held to. What they had begun could not be easily stopped. The descent was complete. The mingling had started, and the earth, still young, began to bear the weight of beings it was never meant to hold. The story had crossed a threshold. There would be no simple return to what had been before. The timing of the descent was recorded with precision. It occurred in the days of Jard, whose name itself carries meaning, derived from a root meaning to descend. Later tradition saw this as no accident. His father Mahalalel had named him prophetically, marking the generation when angels came down to earth. Whether the name predicted the event or simply commemorated it, the association remained fixed in the texts that preserved the memory. Jard's days became synonymous with the breach, the moment when the cosmic order bent. The knowledge the Watchers imparted was not neutral. The Book of Enoch catalogues it in detail, and the list reads like an inventory of corruption. Azazel taught metalworking, the forging of swords, daggers, shields, and breastplates. Before this, humanity had lived simply, without organized warfare, without the capacity to kill on scale. The introduction of weaponry altered not only how men fought, but why. Tools of violence created hierarchies of dominance. Those who possessed them ruled. Those who did not submitted or perished. He also revealed the art of adornment, bracelets, ornaments, cosmetics for the eyes, the use of antimony to beautify eyelids, and the knowledge of precious stones and dyes. The texts frame this as facilitating lust and vanity, the manipulation of appearance to incite desire. What might seem trivial carried deeper implication. It was the introduction of artifice, the alteration of the natural to provoke response. The world, Enoch says, was changed by this. Impiety and fornication increased. Paths became corrupt. Others among the Watchers taught different arts, enchantments and magic, ways to manipulate both natural and supernatural realms. The cutting of roots and trees for pharmaceutical purposes, which the text describes as forbidden knowledge of medicine. Astrology, the reading of celestial signs not for agricultural rhythm, but for divination and control. These teachings granted power without the wisdom to wield it responsibly. Humanity received influence without humility, knowledge without the spiritual maturity required to handle it. The text suggests this was precisely why such knowledge had been withheld, not as arbitrary restriction, but as protection. Certain insights, certain capacities, required preparation that humanity did not yet possess. The Watchers bypassed that preparation. They poured out what should have remained sealed, and the earth absorbed it without filter. The result was predictable. Humanity did not rise to meet the knowledge. The knowledge dragged humanity into realms it could not navigate. The offspring of these unions compounded the crisis. Genesis names them Nephilim and describes them as mighty men of old, men of renown. The Hebrew carries ambiguity. Nephilim may derive from a root meaning to fall, linking them to their father's descent, or from a word indicating great size. The canonical text offers both possibilities without resolving the tension. What remains clear is their nature. They were warriors, figures of strength and fame, beings who commanded attention and fear. The Book of Enoch is less restrained. It describes giants of immense stature whose appetites were insatiable. They consumed the labor of men until there was nothing left to give, and when resources failed, they turned on humanity itself. Violence became endemic. The earth, still learning to sustain mortal life, now bore the weight of creatures whose needs exceeded its capacity. The natural balance collapsed under the pressure of beings who did not belong within it. These giants were not merely large. They represented a category error, hybrids born of a union that violated the created order. Angels and humans occupied separate spheres for reason. The Watcher's transgression erased that separation, and the Nephilim were the living proof of the erasure. They embodied the contamination of boundaries, the mingling of essences never meant to combine. Their existence was itself a disruption. Heaven had not yet responded. The texts describe observation, not intervention. The angels Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel watched as the corruption spread, but the moment for judgment had not yet come. The Watchers continued their work. The giants multiplied. Humanity, caught between angelic instruction and monstrous oppression, spiraled deeper into a condition the texts would later call total corruption. All flesh, Genesis would say, had corrupted its way upon the earth. The oath sworn on Mount Hermon held. The 200 had bound themselves, and none had fled. Their knowledge flowed freely. Their children dominated the land. The world they had entered as observers they now shaped as participants. The boundary between heaven and earth, once clear, had dissolved into ambiguity. What would emerge from that ambiguity was not synthesis but chaos, violence, perversion, the twisting of every natural form into something alien. The descent was complete, but its consequences were only beginning. The Watchers had come down. They had sworn. They had taken. They had taught. And the earth, receiving what it was never meant to hold, began to groan under the weight of it. The offspring were not human. Genesis names them once Nephilim and offers a fragment of description. Mighty men of old, men of renown. The Hebrew word Gibborim, translated mighty men, carries connotations of warriors, heroes, those who dominate through strength and deed. The canonical text frames them neutrally, perhaps even positively, as figures whose martial prowess earned them fame. They were brave fighters who won reputation through their actions. The verse suggests refinement, elevation above their predecessors. But Genesis stops there, offering no further detail about their nature, their size, or what followed their arrival. The Book of Enoch does not stop. It expands what Genesis compresses, and the portrait it paints is darker, more explicit, more catastrophic. Enoch describes them as great giants whose height was 300 cubits. The number has troubled scholars. If a cubit measures 18 inches, 300 cubits would place them at 450 feet tall, an impossibility even within the framework of mythic narrative. Some manuscripts give different figures. Greek fragments suggest 3,000 cubits, which would make them exponentially larger. Others propose 300 ells, still yielding extraordinary height. The exact measurement remains debated, but the intent is clear. These were beings of unnatural, overwhelming stature. Whether the numbers are literal or symbolic, they communicate scale. The Nephilim towered over ordinary men, not merely in physical height but in presence, capacity, and threat. They were not simply larger humans. They were hybrids born of angelic fathers and mortal mothers, occupying a category that violated the created order. Angels were spirits, not flesh. Humans were flesh, not spirits. The Nephilim were both and neither, embodying a fusion that should not have existed. Their appetites reflected their nature. Enoch records that they consumed all the acquisitions of men. The text does not mean occasional taking. It describes systematic depletion. The giants ate what humanity produced, crops, livestock, the labor of fields and flocks, until nothing remained. Men could no longer sustain them. The earth, fertile though it was, could not support beings whose needs exceeded what the natural world was designed to provide. The balance between consumption and replenishment collapsed. When human resources failed, the Nephilim turned. The giants turned against them and devoured mankind. The language is direct. What began as excessive consumption became predation. The offspring of the Watchers began eating human flesh, drinking human blood. They did not stop with humanity. Enoch states they began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish, and to devour one another's flesh and drink the blood. The prohibition against consuming blood, central to later Mosaic law, was violated comprehensively. The natural hierarchy, human stewarding creation, inverted into chaos. The Nephilim preyed on everything. This was not mere hunger. The text frames it as sin, as transgression of boundaries embedded in creation itself. Flesh was not meant to consume flesh indiscriminately. Blood carried life, and life belonged to God alone. The Nephilim's behavior represented total corruption, the dissolution of every restraint. They were giants not only in size but in evil. Their presence spread violence, greed, insatiable appetite. Where they walked, order broke down. Genesis offers a different angle. It calls them Gibborim, warriors who became famous. The Hebrew suggests refinement, perhaps even nobility, men more refined in manners and exalted in thought than their predecessors. They won renown through martial deeds, establishing themselves as leaders, conquerors, figures who commanded respect and fear. The canonical account does not emphasize monstrosity. It emphasizes dominance, the rise of a warrior class whose strength set them apart. Yet even Genesis hints at something darker. The verse places the Nephilim in the same breath as the corruption that follows. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. The mighty men of renown appear just before divine judgment. Their fame, their strength, their elevation, none of it stopped the flood. The text does not explicitly blame them, but the proximity is suggestive. These renowned warriors existed in a world spiraling toward destruction. Enoch leaves no ambiguity. The Nephilim were engines of violence. Their consumption was literal and metaphorical. They devoured resources, lives, order itself. The Dead Sea Scrolls echo this portrayal, linking the giants to widespread chaos and moral decay. The Genesis Apocryphon, found among the scrolls at Qumran, references the Nephilim and frames them within the context of corruption that necessitated the flood. The extra-biblical tradition is consistent. These beings were not heroes. They were catastrophes in human form. Their hybrid nature made them unstable. Half-angelic lineage granted them strength, perhaps longevity, capacities beyond mortal limits. But mortal flesh bound them to earth, to appetites, to drives that divine beings did not possess. The combination produced creatures ruled by hunger and violence, possessing power without the restraint that might have governed it. They were strong enough to dominate but lacked the wisdom or nature to rule justly. The world under their influence transformed. Violence became endemic. Famine spread as they consumed what should have fed thousands. Human society, still young, could not withstand the pressure. Men became prey. The natural world became a battleground. And the knowledge the Watchers had imparted, metallurgy, weaponry, enchantments, equipped the Nephilim with tools to multiply their destruction. Swords forged by angelic instruction now served appetites unchecked by divine restraint. Genesis and Enoch, read together, present two facets of the same reality. One emphasizes fame and martial prowess. The other emphasizes monstrosity and predation. Perhaps both are true. Perhaps the Nephilim were renowned precisely because they were monstrous, feared, and followed because none could resist them. Renown does not require virtue. It requires only visibility, impact, the capacity to be remembered. What they left behind was more than memory. The Book of Enoch addresses a question Genesis does not. What happened to the Nephilim after they died? Human souls descended to Sheol, the shadowy underworld where the dead resided. But the Nephilim were not fully human. Their fathers were angels, spirits who did not possess mortal flesh by nature. Their mothers were human, flesh and blood, subject to death. The offspring inherited both natures, and that dual inheritance created a theological problem when their bodies perished. Enoch provides an answer. When the Nephilim died, their bodies, human and mortal, returned to the earth. But their spirits, carrying the angelic component inherited from their fathers, could not simply dissolve. They were neither fully mortal nor fully divine, and so they became something else, disembodied spirits condemned to wander the earth. The Book of Jubilees elaborates, stating that 10% of these spirits were assigned to Mastema, a figure associated with evil and accusation, while the remaining 90% were confined elsewhere, perhaps in places of binding. These wandering spirits became what later tradition called demons. They were impure mixed entities, neither belonging to heaven nor to Sheol. Their desire was to re-inhabit physical bodies, to regain the embodied existence they had lost. This would explain the behavior of demons in later biblical accounts, where they seek to possess human hosts, desperate to occupy flesh again. The New Testament describes unclean spirits wandering through dry places, seeking rest and finding none, eventually seeking to return to bodies they once inhabited. The framework fits if demons are indeed the disembodied Nephilim. The Book of Enoch goes further. It teaches that evil and suffering on earth arise not primarily from a single satanic figure, but from these Nephilim spirits continuing their destructive work in disembodied form. Without physical bodies, they could no longer devour humans or beasts directly, but they could still influence, oppress, lead astray. Their rampage continued, shifted from physical violence to spiritual corruption. The world's descent into evil, then, was not merely human failure. It was the ongoing consequence of hybrid beings who should never have existed. The Dead Sea Scrolls include fragments of a work called the Book of Giants, which expands on these narratives. It names some of the Nephilim and describes their activities before their destruction. The texts variously call them Nephilim, Gibborim, or Rephaim, overlapping terms that later biblical tradition would associate with different clans of giants. Manichaean fragments label them demons, reinforcing the connection between the antediluvian giants and the evil spirits that followed. Genesis does not engage these details. It simply states what their presence produced. The earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. The Hebrew word for violence, Hamas, suggests not mere individual acts but systemic, pervasive brutality. Multiple translations emphasize this: desecration, infringement, outrage, assault. The Amplified Bible renders the earth as absolutely depraved, spiritually and morally putrid. The corruption was total. It was not confined to specific regions or populations. All flesh had corrupted its way upon the earth. The Nephilim did not cause this alone, but their presence catalyzed it. Their appetites modeled excess. Their violence normalized brutality. Their hybrid nature embodied the dissolution of boundaries. Humanity, already inclined toward sin, found in the giants both oppressors and exemplars. The knowledge the Watchers had taught, weaponry, enchantment, manipulation, gave humans tools to imitate the giants' violence on human scale. What the Nephilim did through strength, men learned to do through craft. The text describes a world where every thought, every intention was only evil continually. This was not hyperbole. It was diagnosis. The natural human condition, already fractured by the fall in Eden, had been compounded by angelic transgression and hybrid offspring. The result was a civilization where goodness had become rare, where violence was the norm, where the created order itself groaned under corruption it could not expel. The Nephilim were not merely participants in this corruption. They were symbols of it, living proof that the boundaries God had set could be violated, that heaven and earth could mingle in ways that produced only chaos. Their strength made them mighty. Their renown made them famous. But their nature made them abominations, beings whose very existence testified to the breakdown of cosmic order. And when they died, they did not rest. If Enoch is correct, their spirits remained, stripped of flesh but not of malice, wandering a world they had helped ruin, seeking bodies to inhabit, continuing in death the destruction they had begun in life. The flood would come and their bodies would perish beneath the waters. But the spirits, according to the text, would endure, agents of corruption long after the world that birthed them had drowned. The sons of the Watchers were mighty men of renown. They were also engines of violence, devourers of humanity, hybrids whose existence violated creation itself. Genesis remembers their fame. Enoch remembers their monstrosity. Both are part of the same story, a story of boundaries crossed, orders broken, and a world spiraling toward judgment it could no longer avoid. The descent brought more than hybrid offspring. The Watchers carried knowledge, celestial understanding, divine secrets, arts and sciences that belonged to realms beyond mortal reach. What they taught was not accidental spillover. The Book of Enoch frames it as deliberate transmission, the sharing of forbidden curriculum that humanity was never meant to possess. Chapter 8 catalogues the lessons in detail, naming both the teachers and their subjects. Each angel introduced something specific. Each teaching altered the world in ways that could not be undone. Azazel stood foremost among the instructors. He taught men to make swords, knives, shields, and breastplates, the full arsenal of organized warfare. Before this, conflict existed, but it lacked the refinement of metallurgy. Azazel revealed the metals of the earth and the art of working them. This was not merely showing humans where copper or iron could be found. It was teaching extraction, smelting, forging, the transformation of raw ore into instruments of death. Weapons multiplied. Violence, which had been personal and limited, became systematic and scalable. But Azazel did not stop with weaponry. He also taught the making of bracelets, ornaments, and the use of antimony for beautifying the eyelids. He revealed how to work with precious stones and all kinds of coloring dyes. In modern terms, this was cosmetology, the art of adorning and altering appearance. The text does not treat this neutrally. It frames cosmetics as tools of seduction and manipulation, methods to incite lust and vanity. Azazel taught humanity to enhance beauty artificially, to use appearance as a weapon in its own right. The teaching had immediate consequences. Enoch records that impiety increased and they turned aside and corrupted all their ways. Fornication multiplied. The link between adornment and moral corruption was direct in the text's view. Cosmetics facilitated desire. Desire led to transgression. Transgression spread like contagion through the population. What seemed innocuous, decoration, beautification, became an accelerant for the very behaviors that would bring judgment. Semyaza, the leader of the Watchers, taught enchantments and the cutting of roots. This was pharmacology in its earliest and darkest form, the knowledge of which plants and roots, when cut and combined, could produce effects beyond natural healing. The text associates this with love potions, spells of bewitchment, sorcery, and practices hateful to God. The manipulation of natural substances to alter minds, emotions, or spiritual states violated boundaries between the natural and supernatural. Some interpreters have noted the resemblance between this ancient teaching and later shamanic practices, particularly the brewing of ayahuasca, a ceremonial drink requiring precise combination of plants to produce DMT. Indigenous traditions preserve methods for creating such substances, yet the scientific knowledge required seems beyond what primitive societies should possess. Could the origin trace back to angelic instruction in those early days? The text leaves the question open but frames the teaching itself as corruption, not enlightenment. Other watchers taught the observation of celestial phenomena. Barakijal taught astrology. Kakibal revealed knowledge of the constellations. Shamsil taught the signs of the sun, Sariel the course of the moon. Ezekiel instructed in the knowledge of clouds, Arakiel in the signs of the earth. These teachings sound like astronomy and meteorology, sciences the modern world values. But the Book of Enoch frames them differently. They were not for agricultural planning or navigation. They were for divination, for reading omens, for attempting to manipulate fate through celestial insight. Irenaeus, an early church father, interpreted these teachings as giving rise to soothsayers, augurs, magicians, and practitioners of dark arts. The knowledge was not neutral. It was not the empirical science of later centuries, but something closer to occultism, the attempt to access hidden things, to predict and control through spiritual means rather than natural observation. The heavens were meant to declare God's glory, not to serve as tools for human manipulation. Armeros taught how to resolve enchantments, countermagic, the breaking of spells. This suggests that the enchantments Semyaza taught created problems requiring solutions, which Armeros then provided. The system was self-perpetuating. One angel taught binding, another taught losing. Humanity became enmeshed in cycles of magical practice, dependent on knowledge that drew them further from the natural order they were meant to inhabit. The cumulative effect was catastrophic. The Book of Enoch states plainly, widespread wickedness arose and they engaged in fornication, were led astray, and corrupted all their ways. The knowledge itself was corrupting. Not because learning is inherently evil, but because this particular knowledge came too soon without preparation from sources that had abandoned their stations. Humanity received tools it could not wield responsibly, power without wisdom, capacity without restraint. The teachings transformed civilization. Warfare became sophisticated and deadly. Vanity and sexual immorality spread through the population. Sorcery and divination replaced simple faith. The natural world, once approached with reverence or fear, became something to manipulate, roots to cut, metals to extract, celestial signs to read for personal advantage. The boundary between heaven and earth, already breached by the Watcher's descent, dissolved further with each lesson taught. The question Enoch addresses, and Genesis does not, is why this knowledge was forbidden. The answer lies not in divine caprice but in divine protection. The angel Uriel, in speaking with Enoch, makes clear that humanity was not meant to learn what the Watchers taught. The restriction was not arbitrary. The knowledge itself was dangerous, not inherently evil, but beyond humanity's capacity to handle responsibly. The Book of Enoch frames it as a matter of timing and readiness. Certain truths, certain capacities, require spiritual maturity before they can be wielded without corruption. The Watchers offered power without responsibility, knowledge without wisdom, and influence without humility. What might have been beneficial if introduced gradually, at the proper stage of human development, became poisonous when given all at once to beings unprepared for it. Humanity lacked the moral and spiritual framework necessary to use these teachings well. God's intention had been for humanity to rely on divine guidance, to find fulfillment in relationship with their Creator rather than in the false security offered by forbidden power. The knowledge the Watchers imparted short-circuited that process. It granted autonomy without wisdom, capacity without character, and once tasted, it could not be unlearned. The damage was irreversible. Humanity had crossed a threshold from which there was no simple return. The teachings did not bring enlightenment. They brought moral decay and societal collapse. Humanity, lost in a maze of power and pride, walked further and further from God, their creator and source of true wisdom. The corruption was comprehensive. Violence filled the earth. Genesis records that God saw the wickedness of man was great, and that every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. The verse reflects the depth of what had happened, a world driven by powers it could not control and knowledge it could not bear. Enoch names this knowledge as eternal mysteries that are in heaven. They were celestial secrets, things known to angelic beings but withheld from mortal ones for reason. Azazel is specifically accused of revealing all unrighteousness on earth and disclosing the eternal secrets which were in heaven, which men were striving to learn. The phrase suggests humanity had been reaching, desiring, striving for such knowledge. The watchers did not force it upon unwilling recipients. They gave humanity what it wanted but should not have possessed. The result was predictable. The teaching of metallurgy led directly to warfare. The revelation of cosmetics facilitated lust and vanity. The instruction in sorcery and root cutting opened doors to spiritual manipulation that should have remained closed. Astrology and the observation of celestial signs turned humanity's gaze upward not in worship but in divination, seeking control over fate rather than submission to the divine order. Each lesson compounded the others, creating a civilization oriented toward domination, manipulation, and self-exaltation. The comparison to Eden is unavoidable. In the garden, the serpent tempted Eve with knowledge of good and evil, knowledge that would make her like God. That act of disobedience opened humanity's eyes to realities they were never meant to possess, resulting in expulsion from paradise. The Watcher's teaching functioned similarly. It granted insight and capacity that elevated humanity beyond its intended station, but the elevation was a fall in disguise. Knowledge without righteousness, power without submission to divine order, led not to godlikeness but to corruption. The earth itself reacted. Enoch records that the ground complained about the lawless ones. The natural world, designed to support mortal life lived within proper boundaries, could not sustain what humanity and the Nephilim had become. The giants devoured the toil of men until humans could no longer feed them. They turned against humanity, consuming flesh and drinking blood. They sinned against birds, beasts, reptiles, and fish, devouring one another in cycles of violence that respected no boundaries. Creation groaned under the weight of corruption it was never structured to hold. God watched. His heart, the text says, was deeply grieved. He regretted making humanity, not because creation was a mistake, but because what it had become was unbearable. The world had lost its way. The knowledge imparted by the Watchers had become a weapon turned against the very beings it was meant to serve. Humanity was entangled in wickedness and rebellion, a far cry from the innocence in which they were created. Judgment became inevitable. The transmission of forbidden knowledge set in motion consequences that could not be reversed by simple repentance or reform. The corruption was systemic. It had penetrated every aspect of human civilization: warfare, sexuality, spirituality, governance, science. The Watchers had not merely taught skills. They had introduced an orientation toward reality that was fundamentally incompatible with the created order. Humanity had learned to manipulate rather than steward, to dominate rather than cultivate, to seek power rather than relationship. The angels who taught would be held accountable. Azazel, singled out for special judgment, would be bound and cast into darkness specifically because he taught humanity forbidden technology, the eternal mysteries of heaven. His punishment exceeded that of the other watchers because his teaching compounded the original transgression. He had not merely descended and taken wives. He had weaponized heaven's secrets, turning divine knowledge into instruments of human destruction. The knowledge could not be taken back. Once revealed, it remained in human consciousness, passed from generation to generation, embedding itself in the fabric of civilization. Even after the flood, traces would endure: metalwork, astrology, pharmacology, the arts of war and seduction. The curriculum the Watchers taught would echo through history, shaping cultures that never knew the original teachers. The forbidden transmission had consequences that outlasted the world that received it. The knowledge the Watchers imparted did not scatter into individual practices. It consolidated. With metallurgy came weaponry, with weaponry came hierarchy, and with hierarchy came dominion. The text suggests that what emerged in the antediluvian world was not merely scattered tribes but organized civilizations, cities, kingdoms, structures of governance ruled by or built for beings whose very existence violated natural order. Genesis offers fragments. The line of Cain built the first city, named Enoch after Cain's son, establishing urbanization almost immediately after the fall. This was not primitive settlement. It presupposed law, division of labor, commerce, communal worship, the full apparatus of civilization. The timing is critical. Cain belonged to the third human generation, living only decades after creation according to traditional chronologies. Urbanization appeared not as gradual evolution from nomadic life, but as immediate capacity, evidence that humanity began with full intellectual and creative faculties. The descendants of Cain introduced metalworking, poetry, and the founding of cities, hallmarks of advanced civilization. Tubal-Cain, Genesis records, was the forger of all instruments of bronze and iron, establishing metallurgy before the Watchers descended. But when the angels brought celestial knowledge of metals and their extraction, the scale and sophistication of what humans could produce multiplied. The convergence was catastrophic. Human ingenuity, already capable of city building, met angelic instruction in warfare and manipulation. The Nephilim, offspring of the Watchers, grew to dominance in these burgeoning civilizations. Their size alone granted authority. In a world where strength determined rulership, beings of immense stature and unnatural power naturally ascended to kingship. The texts do not name their cities explicitly, but they describe societies organized around these hybrid rulers, kingdoms where the sons of the Watchers held sway. Later tradition preserved echoes of this arrangement. Greek mythology claimed that Cyclopean giants built the city of Mycenae, that Poseidon and Apollo constructed the great walls of Troy. These were not merely poetic attributions. They reflected a memory, however distorted, of a time when beings greater than human shaped the foundations of civilization. The Greeks believed their gods hailed from Mesopotamia, Anatolia, Egypt, lands to the east where the oldest cities stood. The connection between giants, divine or semi-divine figures, and the origins of urban civilization persisted across cultures. The archaeological record offers tantalizing suggestions. Sites like Göbekli Tepe present megalithic construction, dated to periods far earlier than conventional models predict, with no evidence of surrounding agriculture, religious or ceremonial structures appearing before the settled farming that supposedly made them possible. The explanation from a biblical framework is straightforward. These were antediluvian sites where civilization existed in forms that do not fit evolutionary models of slow cultural development. The flood destroyed most evidence of agriculture and daily life, leaving only the most massive stone constructions. Tiahuanaco, near Lake Titicaca in Bolivia, presents structures whose scale defies explanation even by modern standards. The Gate of the Sun, carved from a single block of rock, stands 10 feet high and 6 feet wide, the largest carved monolith in the world. The fortress of Akapana, originally a pyramid 167 feet high, measured 650 by 496 feet at its base. The Sun Temple sat on a platform 440 feet long by 390 feet wide, composed of blocks weighing 100 to 200 tons each. Walls incorporated stones of 60 tons. Individual steps in the stone stairways weighed 50 tons apiece. The engineering required to move and position such stones exceeds what pre-industrial civilizations should possess. Modern machinery would find them difficult to work with. Yet there they stand, remnants of construction that predates any known civilization in the region. Tiahuanaco's ruins meet the edge of Lake Titicaca, with clear evidence it once functioned as a seaport. Artifacts lie at the bottom of the lake. If this city rose with the Andes during the catastrophic upheaval of the flood, as some creationists propose, it represents a candidate for pre-flood urban civilization. Baalbek in Lebanon presents similar anomalies. The megaliths incorporated into its foundations are among the largest quarried stones in the world, with some blocks exceeding 800 tons. The precision of their cutting and placement suggests technological sophistication inconsistent with the Bronze Age cultures to whom they are attributed. Traditional archaeology assigns them to Roman construction, but the Romans built on top of pre-existing foundations whose origin they themselves did not claim. The scale suggests builders of extraordinary strength or capacity, beings for whom such stones were manageable. The texts do not describe architecture in detail, but they describe the rulers. The Book of Giants, fragmentary texts found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, names some of the Nephilim and hints at their dominion. Ahia and Hahia, sons of the fallen angel Semyaza, are among those named. The narrative describes dreams and visions experienced by these giants, premonitions of judgment, awareness that their reign would not endure. Yet while they ruled, they commanded. They organized. They built. The vision is of kingdoms where human populations served hybrid overlords. The Nephilim consumed the labor of men, and when resources failed, they consumed men themselves. This was not sustainable governance. It was exploitation elevated to statecraft. Cities arose not as centers of mutual flourishing, but as mechanisms of extraction, where the strong devoured the weak and the weak had no recourse. Law existed, but it served the appetites of those powerful enough to enforce it. Genesis itself preserves a record of rapid cultural development. The line of Cain produced specialists within a few generations. Jabal became the father of those who dwell in tents and raise livestock, establishing pastoral nomadism as a formalized practice. His brother Jubal was the father of all who play the harp and flute, introducing musical instruments and the arts. Their half-brother Tubal-Cain became a forger of every implement of bronze and iron, mastering metallurgy in both materials simultaneously. These were not gradual discoveries spanning millennia. They emerged in consecutive generations, suggesting minds of extraordinary capacity working with full intellectual vigor. The antediluvian world possessed advantages the modern era lacks. All humanity spoke one language, facilitating communication and the rapid exchange of ideas. There were no linguistic barriers to slow the spread of innovation. Metalworking technology enabled the construction of buildings, ships, farming equipment, weapons, and inventions of all sorts. The infrastructure for complex civilization existed centuries before Noah, giving ample time for development that archaeological records, disrupted by the flood's catastrophe, no longer preserve clearly. Some have speculated whether the pre-flood world possessed technologies equal to or exceeding modern capabilities. The question cannot be answered definitively. No electronics or machinery have been unearthed that clearly predate the flood. but the difficulty in identifying antediluvian sites is profound. Most archaeologists do not work within a framework that acknowledges a global deluge, and thus do not search for evidence of pre-flood civilization. The volume of water and sediment involved in such a catastrophe would have buried or obliterated most remains. What has survived are megaliths, structures so massive that neither water nor time could erase them entirely. Göbekli Tepe, the pyramids of Giza, Baalbek, Tiahuanaco, and other sites demonstrate engineering sophistication that modern experts struggle to explain. The precision of stone cutting, the weight of individual blocks, the alignment with astronomical phenomena, all suggest knowledge and capability inconsistent with primitive societies. Whether these were built by the Nephilim directly or by human populations under their dominion, they stand as monuments to a civilization that operated on scales modern archaeology does not expect. The texts describe a world where the boundaries between human and divine had collapsed. The Nephilim ruled not as elected leaders, but as beings whose power could not be contested. Their strength was absolute. Their appetites were insatiable, and the knowledge their fathers had imparted gave them tools to consolidate authority in ways that purely human rulers could not. Cities became centers of worship, commerce, and exploitation. Populations existed to serve the needs of giants whose consumption exceeded what the earth could naturally provide. Later Jewish texts, such as the Book of Jasher, describe the post-flood figure of Nimrod organizing similar structures, assembling armies, conquering enemies, establishing princes and judges, building cities for his palace. Nimrod ruled according to his heart's desire, after having conquered all his enemies. The pattern echoes what likely existed before the flood: centralized power, military dominance, urban centers serving the ambitions of a ruling class. If such organization emerged so quickly after the deluge, it suggests memory of how civilization functioned before. The antediluvian kingdoms were not utopias. They were hierarchies of exploitation, where the strong dominated the weak without restraint. The knowledge the Watchers taught facilitated this domination. Metallurgy produced weapons. Astrology and divination provided means to claim divine sanction. Enchantments and sorcery granted control through spiritual manipulation. The arts of war and adornment, of root cutting and cosmetics, all served to concentrate power in the hands of those who possessed it, and to make resistance futile for those who did not. Violence filled the earth. This was not random chaos but organized brutality, warfare between kingdoms, oppression within them, predation by the Nephilim upon the populations they ruled. Genesis says God looked upon the earth and saw that it was corrupt, that all flesh had corrupted its way. The corruption was structural. It was embedded in the very architecture of civilization, in the cities built to house giants, in the governments organized to serve their appetites, in the economies designed to extract maximum labor from human populations already struggling to survive. Humanity, caught within these kingdoms, had little recourse. The giants were stronger, larger, equipped with knowledge from heaven and power inherited from their angelic fathers. Resistance was futile. Escape was impossible. The world had become a prison where mortal men served immortal appetites, where cities rose not as monuments to human flourishing, but as mechanisms of consumption. The natural order, already strained by the fall in Eden, shattered completely under the weight of beings who should never have existed. The fragmentary accounts do not give names to most of these kingdoms. They do not describe their capitals or their borders, but they describe their nature: organized, hierarchical, violent, corrupt. They describe rulers who were mighty men of renown, warriors whose strength earned them fame and whose fame justified their tyranny. And they describe a world that had deviated so far from its intended design that judgment became inevitable. These were the first giant kingdoms. They rose quickly, consolidated power thoroughly, and spread corruption completely. The knowledge that built them was forbidden. The rulers who commanded them were abominations. And the civilization they created was unsustainable, not merely morally but physically, ecologically, spiritually. The earth could not bear them, heaven would not tolerate them, and the waters, already gathering in the skies, would soon fall. The structures remain, scattered across continents, defying explanation, standing as monuments to capabilities that orthodox chronology cannot accommodate. They are megalithic, built from stones so massive that moving them strains modern engineering, let alone the primitive tools assigned to ancient peoples. The orthodox narrative dismisses them as products of patience and ingenuity, claiming that Bronze Age populations using copper tools, wooden sledges, and sheer manpower achieved what contemporary machinery struggles to replicate. But another framework exists. These could be remnants of the antediluvian world, structures built by or for the Nephilim, whose scale reflects the stature of their builders or inhabitants. Baalbek, in Lebanon's Bekaa Valley, presents the most extreme case. The Temple of Jupiter stands atop a massive platform constructed from stones of inconceivable weight. 3 blocks, known since Byzantine times as the trilithon, form part of the western retaining wall. Each measures 19 meters long, 4 meters high, and 3.5 meters thick, weighing approximately 800 tons. They rest atop a foundation layer of stones weighing 350 tons each. The trilithon sits high above ground level, positioned with precision that modern engineers find remarkable. In the nearby quarry, less than a kilometer away, lies an even larger block, the stone of the pregnant woman, weighing over 1,000 tons. It was quarried but never moved, left partially attached to bedrock as if the builders abandoned the project mid-task. A third stone, discovered recently, weighs an estimated 1,650 tons. These are not anomalies. They represent the standard to which the builders worked, a standard far exceeding what conventional history attributes to ancient civilizations. Modern explanations invoke ingenious techniques, elevation ramps, capstans, counterweights, causeways designed to exploit gravity and mechanical advantage. The theory suggests that ancient engineers used methods lost to history but recoverable through careful analysis. Yet the explanations require assumptions, massive labor forces, decades of sustained effort, logistical coordination across generations that leave questions unanswered. Why build at such scale? Why use stones so large that smaller blocks would serve equally well with far less effort? The answer provided is prestige, ambition, religious devotion. But if the purpose was to house beings of extraordinary size, the scale becomes functional rather than symbolic. The Great Pyramid of Giza invites similar questions. Orthodox Egyptology attributes it to Khufu, a 4th dynasty pharaoh who reigned around 2500 BC. Yet traditions outside mainstream scholarship suggest a different origin. Islamic legends claim the pyramids were built in anticipation of a great flood, erected by pre-Diluvian peoples who possessed knowledge of coming disaster. Edgar Cayce, the 20th century psychic, proposed that migrants from Atlantis constructed the pyramids around 10,500 BC, selecting Giza for its central location among Earth's landmasses, less susceptible to earthquakes and floods than their lost homeland. From this perspective, the pharaohs merely appropriated existing structures, claiming monuments they did not build. The construction methods remain disputed. Recent research suggests pyramid builders exploited the Nile's annual flooding, using high water levels as a hydraulic lift to transport limestone and granite blocks directly to the Giza Plateau. The fluvial port hypothesis proposes that engineers channeled floodwaters to the pyramid site, allowing massive stones to be floated into position rather than dragged overland. The theory fits evidence of water level fluctuations over 8,000 years and explains how blocks weighing tons could be moved without machinery. Yet it does not explain the precision, the tight tolerances, the astronomical alignments, the mathematical relationships encoded in the structure's dimensions. If the pyramid predates the pharaonic period, if it belongs to an antediluvian civilization disrupted by the flood, the sophistication makes sense. A society with access to angelic knowledge, geometry, astronomy, metallurgy, would possess the intellectual framework to design such a monument. Beings of immense stature and strength could manage stones that human laborers would find overwhelming. The pyramid becomes not an isolated achievement, but a remnant of a lost world whose capabilities exceeded those that followed. Other sites echo the pattern. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, dated to approximately 9600 BC, consists of massive T-shaped pillars arranged in circular enclosures. The site predates agriculture, appearing before settled civilizations supposedly made such construction possible. No evidence of habitation surrounds it, only the megaliths, erected for purposes that remain unclear. Conventional archaeology struggles to explain how hunter-gatherers organized labor on this scale. But if the site belongs to the pre-flood world, the mystery dissolves. The builders were not primitive nomads but members of an organized civilization whose records the flood destroyed. Rujum el-Hiyari, in the Golan Heights, presents another enigma. Known in Arabic as the stone heap of the wild cat, the structure consists of concentric stone circles radiating from a central mound. The largest circle spans 160 meters in diameter. The complex contains over 42,000 tons of volcanic rock, carefully placed without mortar. Excavations reveal astronomical alignments, suggesting the builders possessed sophisticated knowledge of seasonal cycles and celestial mechanics. The structure's age remains debated, but its scale and precision align with other megalithic sites attributed to lost civilizations. Arwad, an island off Syria's coast, hides submerged ruins beneath shallow waters. Diving explorations have revealed a megalithic wall constructed from massive limestone blocks fitted tightly together without binding mortar, techniques similar to those found in Peru's ancient stonework. The wall's submersion suggests it was built when sea levels were lower, either before the flood or during the immediate post-diluvian period when ice age melt raised ocean levels. The precision stonework implies advanced engineering, knowledge that conventional timelines struggle to accommodate. Puma Punku, part of the Tiwanaku complex in Bolivia, presents precision that modern stoneworkers find difficult to replicate. The site consists of terrace platforms originally faced with megalithic blocks, some weighing over 130 tons. The stones were cut from red sandstone and andesite, volcanic rock harder than bronze or copper, requiring steel or diamond-tipped tools to shape with such accuracy. Yet the blocks fit together with tolerances so tight that razor blades cannot slip between them. The joints are flush, the angles precise, suggesting prefabrication and mass production, technologies far exceeding what the Tiwanaku culture supposedly possessed. The blocks exhibit uniformity that allows interchangeability, maintaining level surfaces and even joints regardless of arrangement. This implies standardization, planning, perhaps even modular construction systems. Small holes drilled into the andesite with laser-like precision further compound the mystery. Orthodox archaeology dates the site to the 6th century AD based on radiocarbon analysis of organic material in the mound fill beneath the stonework. But the date measures when the earthen platform was constructed, not when the stones themselves were carved and placed. The stonework could be far older, remnants of an earlier civilization that the Tiwanaku people later incorporated into their own structures. Sacsayhuaman, the fortress overlooking Cusco in Peru, demonstrates similar engineering prowess. 3 massive zigzag walls extend over 540 meters, reaching heights of 18 meters. The stones, weighing between 90 and 200 tons, fit together without mortar, their interlocking shapes forming joints so precise that earthquakes which devastated Cusco left the walls standing. The rounded corners, the variety of shapes, the inward lean, all contribute to structural integrity that modern engineers admire but struggle to explain using the tools attributed to the Inca. Spanish chroniclers recorded that over 20,000 laborers worked for a century to complete Sacsayhuaman. Yet the chroniclers also noted that the Inca claimed they did not build it, that they found it already standing and merely refurbished what existed. If true, the fortress predates the Inca Empire by an unknown span, raising questions about who possessed the knowledge and strength to move stones that modern cranes find challenging. The largest blocks were transported 35 kilometers from quarries at Rumicalca, an undertaking requiring logistical coordination and engineering capacity that Bronze Age societies supposedly lacked. Throughout Peru, megalithic doorways present proportions that seem calibrated for beings larger than humans. The trapezoidal entrances vary in size, but the larger ones, called grand entrances, stand 9 feet tall and wide enough for 2 men to pass side by side. These proportions exceed functional necessity for human populations. Some theorists suggest they were designed for beings of greater stature, entities for whom 9-foot doorways were appropriately scaled. The acoustic properties of the trapezoidal design add another layer. The slight angle creates resonances that standard rectangular openings do not produce. Beyond Peru and Bolivia, the pattern repeats. The gates of Ishtar in Babylon towered over 40 feet high, far exceeding the height required for human passage. Nebuchadnezzar II erected them in the 6th century BC, but the scale suggests memory of something larger, perhaps traditions inherited from antediluvian times when such dimensions were functional rather than symbolic. The Gate of All Nations at Persepolis stands over 30 feet tall, flanked by statues of griffins and bulls that dwarf visitors. The Pantheon doors in Rome rise 24 feet, monumental by any standard. Egyptian temple entrances depict gigantic gods and pharaohs in proportions that ancient artists may have intended literally, not metaphorically. The question persists, why build at such scale? The conventional answer is grandeur, religious awe, the desire to impress and intimidate. But if the builders or their rulers were themselves of immense size, the architecture becomes practical. Nephilim standing 12, 15, perhaps 20 feet tall would require doorways, ceilings, and chambers built to accommodate their frames. The megalithic structures scattered across the globe, with their oversized entrances and massive stone blocks, fit this framework better than they fit the narrative of Bronze Age humans laboriously assembling monuments for symbolic purposes alone. The flood, according to Genesis, covered the earth completely, drowning all terrestrial life except what Noah preserved in the ark. Such a catastrophe would bury or obliterate most evidence of antediluvian civilization. Wooden structures would rot. Metalwork would corrode. Clay and mud brick would dissolve into sediment. Only the most massive stone constructions, those built from blocks too large for floodwaters to displace, would survive, buried under layers of mud and debris, waiting for later civilizations to unearth them or build upon their foundations. This explains why so many megalithic sites share characteristics: precision stonework, massive blocks, astronomical alignments, locations at high elevations or on bedrock foundations. These are the structures that endured, either because they stood above the highest flood levels or because their sheer mass resisted destruction. Later peoples found them, marveled at them, incorporated them into their own building projects, and claimed them as ancestral works. The Inca did not build Sacsayhuaman, they repaired it. The Egyptians did not construct the Great Pyramid, they inherited it. The pattern suggests a lost civilization whose architectural legacy persisted long after its builders perished. The texts do not describe these buildings in detail. Genesis and Enoch focus on moral corruption, not engineering achievements, but later traditions preserve echoes. Greek mythology attributed cyclopean walls to giants. Islamic legends claim the pyramids were built before the flood by peoples who anticipated disaster. Andean myths spoke of Viracocha and earlier builders who shaped the world before the current age. These memories, fragmented and distorted through millennia, may point to a common origin, a time when beings of extraordinary size and knowledge erected monuments that ordinary humans could not duplicate. Whether any trace survived depends on how thoroughly the flood reshaped the earth. If catastrophic, few remnants would remain accessible. If localized to lower elevations, sites on mountains or high plateaus might have endured with minimal damage. The evidence is circumstantial, megalithic structures whose construction defies explanation, proportions that seem calibrated for larger beings, precision that suggests advanced knowledge. The texts leave the question open. The stones remain, silent witnesses to a world that was. The phrase appears without elaboration. Genesis 6:12 records that God looked on the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way upon the earth. The verse is brief, almost clinical in tone, but the implications are vast. The corruption was not localized. It was not confined to specific populations or regions. All flesh, the entirety of living creatures, had corrupted their way. The Hebrew does not soften the claim. It presents total moral collapse, comprehensive deviation from the created order. The word flesh in this context primarily denotes humanity. The expression corrupted their way applies to moral agents capable of choosing evil, not to animals acting on instinct. Humanity had taken what God made good, including themselves, and twisted it towards selfishness and wickedness. Every person was guilty. Every heart inclined only toward evil continually. The corruption was self-inflicted, chosen, deliberate. God's intent for human flourishing had been rejected in favor of violence, lust, and rebellion. Yet the phrase all flesh may carry broader implications. Some scholars note that in Genesis 6:13 and 6:17 the same term encompasses both humans and animals. In Genesis 6:19 it denotes animals exclusively. The precise meaning shifts with context. If animals are included in 6:12, the corruption extended beyond human moral failure into the natural world itself. The boundaries between species, between kinds, had been violated in ways that defiled creation at a structural level. One hypothesis suggests the animals had become violently carnivorous in unprecedented ways. Before the flood, humanity was commanded to eat plants, and animals were not yet afraid of men. If omnivores and carnivores turned rampant, killing and consuming humanity without restraint, they could threaten extinction-level depopulation. The herbivores would vanish, the carnivores would follow, and the natural order would collapse into chaos. Such behavior might justify describing even animals as having corrupted their way, though the language remains primarily directed toward human sin. Another interpretation suggests genetic corruption. The Book of Jasher, a text referenced in the Old Testament but not included in the canon, claims that men in Noah's day began to mingle the species of animals and plants. This genetic manipulation, crossing boundaries between kinds that God had established, rendered all flesh corrupt. The practice was not primitive. It reflected sophisticated knowledge of biology, possibly imparted by the Watchers as part of their forbidden curriculum. If antediluvian civilization possessed genetic technology comparable to modern CRISPR gene editing, the corruption of all flesh becomes literal. Hybrid creatures, transgenic beings, organisms whose very DNA violated the order established at creation. Jennifer Doudna, co-discoverer of CRISPR, has acknowledged the profound ethical questions raised by humanity's newfound ability to edit genes. If modern science only recently rediscovered what the antediluvians knew universally, the corruption described in Genesis takes on new dimensions. The Watchers taught knowledge that heaven had withheld. Among those teachings could have been the manipulation of life itself, the blending of species, the creation of beings that should not exist. The flood, then, became necessary not merely to punish moral evil, but to erase genetic abominations that contaminated the created order beyond recovery. The Nephilim themselves embodied this corruption. Born of angels and humans, they were genetic hybrids whose existence violated the separation between heaven and earth. Their behavior compounded the violation. The Book of Enoch describes them consuming humanity's resources until nothing remained, then turning to cannibalism. They devoured their own parents and children without restraint. The giants did not merely kill for food. They engaged in atrocities, bestiality, crossbreeding with animals, vampirism. The practices left legacies that echoed through post-flood mythology and folklore. Ancient histories and mythologies across cultures preserve memories of these behaviors. Native American traditions speak of cannibal giants. Greek myths describe titans and hybrid monsters. The consistency suggests common origin, a time when such beings actually existed and left impressions so deep that every culture remembers them, however distortedly. The Nephilim were not heroes in these accounts. They were terrors, creatures whose appetites knew no bounds, whose strength made resistance futile, whose presence brought death and despair. The violence they unleashed filled the earth. Genesis uses the Hebrew word Hamas, not random acts but systemic brutality, organized oppression, pervasive cruelty. The Nephilim ruled through force. They took what they wanted. They destroyed what resisted them. And because they possessed knowledge from heaven, metallurgy, weaponry, sorcery, they equipped themselves to maximize destruction. Warfare became sophisticated. Torture became refined. The capacity to inflict suffering multiplied beyond what purely human civilizations could achieve. Humanity, caught in this maelstrom, imitated what it witnessed. The Watchers taught forbidden knowledge. The Nephilim modeled violence, and humans learned both. Sexual immorality spread without restraint, fornication, incest, adultery practiced openly. Jewish tradition records that the generations of Cain engaged in every form of defilement, men and women behaving like beasts, defiling themselves with their mothers, sisters, and brothers' wives. The family unit, designed as the foundation of social order, collapsed into chaos. Idolatry replaced true worship. The holy mountain where righteous men had dwelt emptied as people descended to mix with the daughters of Cain and worship strange gods. The distinction between Seth's line, preservers of godly heritage, and Cain's line, marked by violence and rebellion, dissolved. Intermarriage erased boundaries. The faithful became unfaithful. The righteous became corrupt. By Noah's generation, only 8 souls remained who had not succumbed. Genesis 6:5 provides the diagnosis. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. The verse dissects human nature with surgical precision, not merely actions but intentions, not merely thoughts but the very imagination. The formative processes of the mind were corrupt. The Hebrew term translated imagination refers to the shape or form of thoughts, the embodied ideas that the heart generates. Every such form, every mental construct, every design and device was evil. The wickedness was not occasional. It was perpetual, continually, all the day, from morning to night without reprieve. There was no reproof of conscience, no fear of divine justice, no internal break that limited the descent into depravity. The text emphasizes totality, every imagination only evil continually, not one good thought, not one righteous intention, not one moment of moral clarity. Humanity had become comprehensively corrupted from birth, from youth upward through every stage of life. This was not genetic predisposition alone. It was deliberate cultivation. The corruption was designed, contrived, intentional. People did not merely fall into evil through carelessness. They planned wickedness, devised mischief, schemed how to maximize harm. Their actions were vile, but more fundamentally, their principles were bankrupt. The soul itself, the noblest part of human nature which might have resisted contamination, had been infected completely. Mind, will, emotion, all oriented toward evil as their natural and continuous state. The earth itself responded. The Book of Enoch records that the ground brought accusation against the lawless ones, petitioned heaven, crying out in protest against the violence inflicted upon it. This was no metaphor. The text presents the earth as an actor in the drama, a victim acquiring personhood through its suffering, using standard terms for appeals to Hellenistic officials or monarchs. The earth cried out because much blood was poured out upon it. The giants devoured one another, consumed humans, violated every living creature, and the land absorbed the consequences. Humanity joined the earth's cry. The voice of those who were perishing went up to heaven. The archangels, Michael, Uriel, Raphael, and Gabriel, looked down from holy heaven and saw the bloodshed. They observed the carnage, heard the laments, and reported to one another, "The voice of those who are crying out on earth has reached the gates of heaven." The pleas were unceasing. Justice was demanded. Lawlessness reigned, and the suffering had become unbearable. A profound solidarity existed between the suffering earth and suffering humanity. Both were victims of the Nephilim. Both endured violence they could not stop. Both cried out to heaven for intervention. The natural world and the human world, designed to function in harmony, now shared a common experience: oppression by beings who violated the created order simply by existing. The Watchers had descended, the Nephilim had multiplied, and the entire structure of reality groaned under the weight. Yet amid total corruption, one man stood apart. Genesis 6:9 states that Noah was a just man, perfect in his generations. Noah walked with God. The phrase "perfect in his generations" has sparked debate. Some interpret it as genetic purity. Noah's bloodline remained unmixed with Nephilim ancestry, free from the hybridization that contaminated others. If all flesh had corrupted their way through genetic manipulation, Noah's family represented the last unpolluted human DNA, the only lineage preserving humanity as God created it. Others understand perfect in his generations as moral rather than genetic purity. The Hebrew word tamim, translated perfect, appears elsewhere in Genesis describing animals without blemish, suitable for sacrifice. Applied to Noah, it suggests spiritual maturity, blamelessness, wholehearted relationship with God. Noah had been forgiven of his sins and rendered guiltless. He was head and shoulders above his contemporaries in righteousness, walking with God in a generation where every other person's thoughts were only evil continually. Both interpretations may hold true simultaneously. Noah was morally upright and genetically pure. He walked with God, maintaining righteousness in a world drowning in evil. And his family's DNA remained uncorrupted, preserving the human genome as originally designed. If genetic manipulation had spread universally, contaminating all other bloodlines, Noah's family became essential not merely for moral reasons but for biological ones. They were the last repository of true humanity, the final remnant of Adamic stock untainted by angelic human hybridization or transgenic experimentation. The corruption had reached critical mass. Every imagination evil continually, all flesh corrupted, the earth crying out, humanity crying out, the Nephilim consuming everything, violating every boundary, spreading chaos wherever they walked. The knowledge the Watchers taught had been weaponized. Metallurgy produced instruments of death. Sorcery manipulated spiritual forces. Genetic technology created abominations. The world God had called very good at creation had been transformed into something unrecognizable, a nightmare of violence, perversion, and systemic rebellion against the created order. God's response was grief and resolve. Genesis 6:6 records that it grieved him to his heart. The wickedness caused divine sorrow, a heart-level response to the ruin of what he had made good. But sorrow alone could not resolve the crisis. The corruption was too deep, too pervasive, too structural. Reformation was impossible. Humanity would not repent because humanity could not repent. Every thought was evil, every intention corrupted. The Nephilim would not cease because their nature drove them to consume and destroy. The earth could not heal while the beings violating it continued to exist. Judgment became inevitable, not as punishment for isolated sins, but as surgery to remove cancer that had metastasized throughout creation. The flood would not merely discipline. It would erase, cleanse, reset. All flesh that had corrupted its way would perish. The Nephilim would drown. The humans who served them, imitated them, or simply existed alongside them without righteousness would be swept away. Only Noah, perfect in his generations, and his family would cross the boundary between the old world and the new. The corruption of all flesh demanded total destruction, and the waters already gathering were about to fall. The cries did not dissipate into silence. They ascended. The Book of Enoch records that the earth made desolate cried out, and the voice of its crying rose to the gates of heaven. The souls of men added their plea, saying, "Bring our cause before the Most High." The suffering was comprehensive. The land itself and the people upon it both petitioned for intervention. The violence, the bloodshed, the lawlessness had reached levels that demanded divine response. 4 archangels stood watch. Michael, Uriel, Raphael, and Gabriel looked down from heaven and saw much blood being shed upon the earth and all lawlessness being wrought. These were not minor angels. They were chief princes, high-ranking beings who stood in the presence of God. The Book of Enoch names 7 archangels in total: Uriel, Raphael, Raguel, Michael, Sarachael, Gabriel, and Remiel. But these 4 feature most prominently in the narrative. They served as observers, watchers in the true sense, assigned to monitor creation and report to the throne. What they observed was catastrophic. The watchers had descended. The Nephilim had multiplied. Humanity had been corrupted completely. The earth was soaked in blood from violence that showed no sign of abating. The archangels turned to one another and acknowledged the severity. The earth made without inhabitant cries the voice of their cryings up to the gates of heaven. The phrase "without inhabitant" suggests depopulation, the systematic extermination of human populations by the giants who consumed them. The world was becoming uninhabitable, not through natural disaster but through predation and corruption. The archangels understood that they were hearing the cries of mortals, interpreting the severity of what was happening, and realizing they needed to inform God. This raises theological questions. Did God not already know? The text suggests he did. God saw everything before it happened. But the narrative framework requires the archangels to petition, to bring the case formally before the throne, to trigger the divine response that would follow. Heaven operated with order, with protocol, with proper channels even when the outcome was foreordained. They approached the Lord of Lords, the King of Kings, the God of Gods, the Lord of Spirits. The titles emphasize sovereignty, authority, the supreme position from which judgment would be pronounced. The archangels presented their case. You see what Azazel has done, how he has taught all unrighteousness on earth and revealed the eternal secrets which were preserved in heaven, which men were striving to learn. Azazel was singled out. His teaching of forbidden knowledge, metallurgy, cosmetics, the manipulation of creation, had compounded the original transgression of descent and mingling. The petition continued, "And Semyaza, to whom you have given authority to bear rule over his associates." Semyaza, the leader of the 200, was named directly. The archangels recounted how the watchers had gone to the daughters of men, lain with them as men do with women, defiled themselves, and revealed to humanity all manner of sins. The women had borne giants whose height was 3,000 ells, beings who consumed all the acquisitions of men. When humanity could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against humans and devoured them. The archangels described the consequences. The giants are slaying one another and devouring each other, and the earth cries out against them. The violence was not merely directed outward against humanity. It had become internecine, with the Nephilim turning on one another in cycles of cannibalism and brutality. The earth itself became an actor, crying out in protest, bringing accusation against the lawless ones who violated it. The natural world and the human world both appealed for justice, for intervention, for an end to suffering that had no natural resolution. The archangels concluded their petition. And now, behold, the souls of those who have died cry out and make their suit to the gates of heaven, and their lamentations have ascended, and they cannot escape from the unrighteousness which is wrought on the earth. The dead joined the living in petition. Those already slain by the Nephilim, whose blood soaked the ground, demanded justice. Their voices rose alongside the cries of survivors who faced the same fate. The cumulative weight of suffering demanded response. God listened. The text does not describe divine surprise or deliberation. God had seen everything before it happened. He had known the watchers would descend, known the Nephilim would arise, known the corruption would spread. Yet the moment for judgment required formal petition, the bringing of the case, the archangels standing as advocates for creation itself. The protocol was fulfilled. The cry had reached heaven, and the response would be swift, comprehensive, and irreversible. The Lord spoke to the archangels, assigning each a specific task. The judgment would be executed by the same beings who had petitioned for it. They would become instruments of divine justice, carrying out sentence against the watchers, the Nephilim, and the corrupted world. The decree was absolute. The watchers would be bound. Their offspring would be destroyed. The earth would be cleansed. And a flood would erase the world that had violated creation's order beyond repair. The cry that reached heaven was not ignored. It was answered. But the answer was not rescue for the current generation. It was reset, total destruction followed by new beginning. Only Noah, perfect in his generations, and his family would survive to carry humanity forward. The rest would perish beneath waters that would cover even the highest mountains. The archangels had brought the case. God had pronounced judgment, and the execution of that judgment was about to begin. God addressed each archangel individually, assigning specific tasks in the execution of judgment. The commands were precise, leaving no ambiguity about what was to happen. The response to the cry that reached heaven would be comprehensive, affecting the watchers, the Nephilim, humanity, and the earth itself. To Uriel, God spoke first. "Go to Noah and tell him in my name, hide thyself, and reveal to him the end that is approaching, that the whole earth will be destroyed, and a deluge is about to come upon the whole earth, and will destroy all that is on it." Uriel was dispatched to warn the one righteous man, the only human whose lineage remained uncorrupted. Noah needed to know what was coming to prepare, to build the ark that would preserve his family and representatives of every animal kind. God instructed Uriel to tell Noah that his seed would be preserved for all generations of the world. The warning was not merely informational, it was directive. Noah would receive specific instructions on how to escape the coming destruction, ensuring that humanity could continue after the flood cleansed the earth. Uriel's mission was mercy within judgment, delivering hope to the one man who walked with God while the rest of the world spiraled toward destruction. The preservation of Noah's family was essential not just for moral reasons but for practical ones. Someone had to survive to repopulate the earth after the waters receded. To Raphael, God gave a harsher assignment: proceed against Azazel, bind him hand and foot and cast him into the darkness. The command was specific. Raphael was to make a hole in the desert, specifically in Dudal, and throw Azazel into it. He was to place jagged and sharp rocks upon him, cover him with darkness, and let him remain there forever. Azazel would not see light again. On the great day of judgment, he would be cast into fire. The severity of Azazel's punishment exceeded that of the other watchers. He had taught humanity forbidden knowledge, the secrets of metallurgy, cosmetics, the eternal mysteries preserved in heaven. His teaching compounded the original sin of dissent and mingling. He weaponized divine knowledge, transforming it into instruments of destruction and tools of vanity. The text explicitly states, "The whole earth has been corrupted through the works that were taught by Azazel. To him ascribe all sin." The responsibility for humanity's corruption was laid at his feet. Raphael carried out the command. The Book of Enoch describes the confrontation. Raphael bound Azazel hand and foot, casting him into the desert wilderness of Dudal, covering him with jagged rocks and condemning him to darkness until the final judgment. The binding was complete, irreversible, executed with divine authority that Azazel could not resist. His rebellion had ended. His influence was sealed away. To Gabriel, God assigned a different task: proceed against the children of fornication and destroy the children of the watchers from among men. Send them one against the other that they may destroy each other in battle. This was a strategy of internal destruction. The Nephilim, already prone to violence and cannibalism, would turn fully upon one another. Gabriel's role was to incite mutual destruction, ensuring the giants eliminated themselves rather than requiring direct divine intervention to kill each one individually. The strategy was efficient and fitting. The Nephilim had consumed humanity, devoured one another, filled the earth with violence. Now that violence would be their undoing. They would fight, kill, consume until none remained. The length of their days would not matter. Whether they lived 70 generations or 500 years, they would not endure. Their destruction was certain, and Gabriel would orchestrate it by turning their own nature against them. To Michael, the leader of the archangels, God gave authority over Semyaza and his associates. Go, bind Semyaza and his associates who have united themselves with women to have defiled themselves with them in all their uncleanness. Michael was to bind them for 70 generations in the valleys of the earth, beneath jagged rocks until the day of their judgment. They would watch their children, the Nephilim, destroy one another, powerless to intervene. Michael executed the command with precision. The text describes how he confronted Semyaza, bound him with chains of divine light, and cast him into the abyss. The other watchers who had followed Semyaza's lead suffered the same fate, imprisoned in darkness, bound until the final judgment when they would be cast into fire for eternal torment. Their transgression had been deliberate, their oath on Mount Hermon binding them to collective guilt. Now they would endure collective punishment. The archangels moved swiftly. Uriel delivered the warning to Noah. Raphael bound Azazel in the desert. Gabriel set the Nephilim against one another. Michael imprisoned Semyaza and his companions. The heavenly response to the earthly cry was total, addressing every level of corruption: the teachers, the offspring, the corrupted humanity, and providing escape for the one righteous family. But the judgment was not yet complete. God declared to Michael, "When their sons have slain one another, and they have seen the destruction of their beloved ones, bind them fast for 70 generations in the valleys of the earth, till the day of their judgment and of their consummation, till the judgment that is forever and ever is consummated." The watchers would witness their legacy destroyed before their own final condemnation. They would see the Nephilim die, knowing they had caused it. Then they would remain bound, awaiting eternal fire. God also pronounced restoration. To Noah through Uriel came the promise, announced to Noah the restoration of the earth. For I shall restore the earth so that not all the sons of men will be destroyed. The flood would cleanse, but it would not exterminate. A remnant would survive. The earth would heal. Righteousness would return, at least for a time. The cry that reached heaven had been answered with judgment, but also with mercy, selective, limited to 8 souls, but mercy nonetheless. The archangels had observed, they had petitioned, they had received commands, and they had executed those commands with precision. The watchers were bound. The Nephilim were condemned to mutual destruction. Noah was warned. The earth awaited cleansing. Heaven had responded to the cry that rose from creation's suffering. And the waters were about to fall. The archangels moved swiftly. Judgment had been pronounced, and execution followed without delay. The watchers, who had descended by choice and sworn oaths binding them to transgression, now faced binding of a different kind. Chains, darkness, imprisonment in places where light could not reach, and freedom was forever lost. Their rebellion had ended. Their influence would be sealed. And the knowledge they had taught, though it could not be erased from human memory, would cease flowing from its angelic source. Raphael received the first and perhaps harshest assignment, the binding of Azazel. God's command was explicit. Bind Azazel hand and foot and cast him into the darkness. Make an opening in the desert which is in Dudal and cast him therein. The location was specific, not some distant underworld dimension, but a place on earth, in the desert, accessible yet desolate. Dudal, whose name may derive from Hebrew roots meaning cauldron of God or boiling pot of God, was a wilderness of absolute emptiness. Raphael carried out the sentence with precision. He bound Azazel's hands and feet with chains that burned like stars, celestial bonds that no fallen angel could break. The archangel cast him into a chasm in the desert, a pit prepared for this purpose, and placed upon him rough and jagged rocks. The rocks were not merely weight. They were torment, sharp edges pressing into immortal flesh, a constant physical reminder of judgment. Darkness covered him completely. His face was veiled so that he could not see light. In that condition, Azazel would remain forever, or at least until the great day of judgment when he would be cast into fire. The location of Dudal has puzzled interpreters. Some identify it with the wilderness where the scapegoat was sent on Yom Kippur, east of Jerusalem, a desolate region associated with sin-bearing and exile. Others suggest it exists in spiritual dimensions accessed through physical geography, but not bound to visible coordinates. What matters is that Dudal was not underground in the sense of caves or caverns. It was beneath rocks, covered and contained, but still part of the physical realm Azazel had descended to corrupt. He remained on earth, imprisoned within the world he had helped destroy. The severity of Azazel's punishment exceeded that of the other watchers because his crime was compounded. The text states clearly, "The whole earth has been corrupted through the works taught by Azazel. Accuse him of every sin." He had not merely descended and taken wives. He had revealed eternal secrets, metallurgy, cosmetics, the manipulation of creation through knowledge meant to remain in heaven. His teaching weaponized divine wisdom, transforming it into instruments of war, vanity, and corruption. All sin, in some measure, traced back to what he had disclosed. Michael received a different assignment, the binding of Semyaza and his associates. God commanded, "Go, bind Semyaza and his associates who have united themselves with women, so as to have defiled themselves with them in all their uncleanness." The punishment carried a cruel irony. Before they were bound, they would witness the destruction of their beloved ones, the Nephilim, their sons, slaying one another in mutual destruction orchestrated by Gabriel. Only after watching their legacy annihilated would the watchers be imprisoned. Michael executed the command. He bound Semyaza and those who had followed him, Uriel, Achibiel, Tamiel, Ramuel, Danel, and the others whose names the Book of Enoch preserved. They were cast into valleys of the earth, bound fast beneath jagged rocks, imprisoned for 70 generations. The duration, 70 generations, suggested a span nearly incomprehensible, long enough that civilizations would rise and fall multiple times before their sentence approached completion. Yet even that was not final. The 70 generations extended only until the day of their judgment and of their consummation, till the judgment that is forever and ever is consummated. The binding was comprehensive, hands and feet chained, preventing movement, rocks piled upon them, creating weight and confinement, darkness enveloping them, depriving sight and hope. The valleys where they were imprisoned became known in later tradition as places of divine wrath, regions where rebellious angels awaited final condemnation. Some scholars connect these valleys to Tartarus, the Greek underworld where the Titans were imprisoned after their rebellion against Zeus. Tartarus, according to Greek mythology, was as far beneath Hades as heaven was above earth. Hesiod described it as a place a bronze anvil would take 9 days to fall from earth to reach. The imprisoned Titans suffered eternal punishment there, locked behind triple walls, guarded by monsters, tormented without hope of escape. The parallels to Enoch's description of the Watcher's imprisonment are striking. Both involve rebellious divine beings cast into darkness, bound in deep places, awaiting final judgment. The Book of Enoch preserves a vision Enoch himself received of these imprisoned angels. He described seeing 7 stars like great burning mountains, bound in a place that had no firmament of heaven above and no firmly founded earth beneath. The angel guiding Enoch explained, "This place is the end of heaven and earth. This has become a prison for the stars and the host of heaven." The stars were not literal celestial bodies but angels, divine beings whose light had been extinguished, whose freedom had been revoked, whose future held only fire. The Watcher's punishment was not merely retributive, it was preventative. Bound and sealed, they could no longer descend, no longer teach, no longer interact with humanity. The transmission of forbidden knowledge ceased at its source. What humans had already learned remained: metallurgy, weaponry, sorcery, astrology. But no new secrets would flow from angelic instruction. The pipeline was cut. Heaven's mysteries would stay in heaven. The New Testament confirms what the Book of Enoch describes. 2 Peter 2:4 states, "For if God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them down to Tartarus and committed them to chains of darkness, to be kept for judgment." The Greek text uses the specific word Tartarus, not Hades, not Gehenna, but the deep prison reserved for rebellious divine beings. These angels were thrown down, bound in chains, and held in darkness awaiting final judgment. Jude 6 offers parallel testimony. "And the angels who did not keep their own position, but left their proper dwelling, he has kept in eternal chains in deepest darkness for the judgment of the great day." The phrase "did not keep their own position" points to abandonment of assigned roles. They left their proper dwelling, heaven, and descended to earth, violating the boundary between celestial and terrestrial realms. For this transgression, God reserved them in everlasting chains under darkness until the judgment of the great day. The canonical texts do not name the fallen angels or specify their crimes in detail, but read alongside Enoch, the references become clear. The angels who sinned were the Watchers. The transgression was descent, mingling with human women and teaching forbidden knowledge. The chains of darkness were literal imprisonment in valleys beneath jagged rocks, and the judgment awaiting them was fire, eternal condemnation in the lake of fire prepared for the devil and his angels. The Watchers did not accept their fate quietly. Enoch records that after being bound, they petitioned for mercy. They trembled in fear, realizing the magnitude of judgment pronounced against them. They begged Enoch to draw up a petition on their behalf, to present their case before the Lord of heaven, hoping to find forgiveness. They could no longer speak directly to God or lift their eyes to heaven for shame of their sins. They needed an intermediary, and Enoch was the only righteous man available. Enoch agreed, though the text does not explain why. Perhaps he felt compassion. Perhaps he understood his role as mediator required him to carry their plea even if he knew the outcome. He wrote the petition, reading it in the presence of the Lord. The watchers waited, hoping divine mercy would relent, that punishment might be commuted, that some path to restoration might exist. The answer was absolute rejection. God did not forgive the watchers on earth. The petition Enoch wrote was thoroughly rejected. No request they made would be granted, neither for themselves nor for their offspring. They had hoped to live an eternal life, that each might live 500 years in some lesser state if not restored to heaven, but even this was denied. The sentence stood. The binding remained. The darkness would not lift. The rejection underscores the severity of their crime. Other sins might find forgiveness. Other transgressions might allow repentance and restoration. But the watchers had violated creation at its foundation. They had crossed boundaries meant to remain inviolate. They had taught what must remain secret. They had fathered beings who should never have existed. And they had done all this deliberately, after swearing oaths that bound them to collective transgression. Their rebellion was premeditated, coordinated, comprehensive. No mercy could be extended without undermining the entire moral order of creation. The effects of their teaching, however, remained. Though the watchers were bound and could no longer instruct, humanity retained what it had learned. Metallurgy continued. Weaponry proliferated. Astrology and sorcery persisted. Cosmetics and adornment remained part of human culture. The knowledge could not be unlearned. It had entered the collective consciousness, passed from generation to generation, embedded in the fabric of civilization. The flood would destroy the antediluvian world, but the knowledge would survive through Noah's family and resurface in post-flood societies. This created an ongoing problem. The source was sealed, but the stream continued. The angels who taught were bound in darkness, but their curriculum lived on in human memory. Every sword forged, every enchantment spoken, every celestial sign read for divination, all traced back to what the watchers had revealed. The corruption they initiated could not be fully eradicated without destroying humanity entirely. And God had chosen to preserve a remnant, to allow Noah and his family to carry humanity forward despite the contamination. The binding of the watchers was just necessary and irreversible. Azazel lay beneath jagged rocks in Dudo, covered in darkness, awaiting the day when he would be cast into fire. Semyaza and his associates remained imprisoned in valleys of the earth, bound for 70 generations until the final judgment. Their influence ceased. Their voices fell silent. Their direct interaction with humanity ended. But their legacy endured, hybrid offspring destroying one another, corrupted humanity spiraling toward judgment, and knowledge that would outlast the flood and shape civilizations for millennia to come. The transmission had ceased. The teachers were bound. But the lessons they taught remained, passed down through Noah, preserved in fragments of memory, rediscovered by later generations who did not know their origin. The watchers had been stopped, but the damage they inflicted could not be entirely undone. Heaven had intervened, binding the rebels in chains of darkness, but earth still bore the scars of their descent, and those scars would persist long after the waters receded. The binding was complete. The watchers awaited final judgment, and the world they had corrupted prepared to drown. God spoke. The decision was final. Genesis 6:13 records the moment. And God said to Noah, "The end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth." The language was absolute, not reformation, not partial judgment, not selective punishment. The end of all flesh, total, comprehensive, irreversible. The violence that filled the earth demanded not correction but erasure, not discipline but destruction. The decree was not arbitrary. God explained his reasoning. The earth was filled with violence because of humanity. Every imagination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. The Nephilim had consumed the labor of men, then consumed men themselves. The Watchers had taught forbidden knowledge. Genetic corruption had spread through all flesh. Moral depravity had become universal. The created order, designed to function within boundaries God had established, had collapsed into chaos that could not be reformed from within. God addressed Noah directly, singling him out as the sole exception. Noah was a just man, perfect in his generations. Noah walked with God. In a world where everyone else had corrupted their way, Noah remained righteous. His lineage was pure, his relationship with God intact, his moral character unblemished. He was not sinless. No human after Eden achieved that, but he was blameless, justified by faith, set apart from the corruption surrounding him. For this reason, God chose to preserve him and his family while destroying everyone else. The command was specific. Make yourself an ark of cypress wood, make rooms in it and coat it with pitch inside and out. God provided exact dimensions, 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 15 cubits high. The structure would have 3 decks, a window finished to a cubit from above, and a door set in its side. Every detail mattered. The ark was not merely a boat. It was a vessel of salvation, the only means of escape from the coming destruction, the boundary between the old world and the new. The purpose was explicit. And behold, I myself am bringing floodwaters on the earth, to destroy from under heaven all flesh in which is the breath of life. Everything that is on the earth shall die. The flood would be global, comprehensive, leaving no terrestrial life untouched. Everything with breath would perish, humans, animals, birds, creatures great and small. The Nephilim, despite their size and strength, would drown. The corrupted populations they ruled would be swept away. The antediluvian civilizations, with their cities and technologies, would vanish beneath the waters, but God paired destruction with preservation. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall go into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. 8 souls would survive: Noah, his wife, their 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their sons' wives. Only these 8 would cross the boundary between the old world and the new, carrying humanity forward, despite the universal judgment falling upon their generation. God commanded Noah to bring representatives of every animal kind into the ark as well. And of every living thing of all flesh you shall bring 2 of every sort into the ark, to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female. The preservation extended beyond humanity. The animal kingdom, though it had suffered under the Nephilim's predation and humanity's corruption, would be saved through Noah's obedience. Male and female pairs of every kind, birds, cattle, creeping things, would enter the ark and survive the flood. The timeline was set, though the exact moment remained unstated in Genesis 6. God did not tell Noah when the flood would come, only that it was certain. Noah received the command to build the ark and began construction, a process that would take years, perhaps decades. During that time, he preached righteousness to his generation, warning them of coming judgment, offering them opportunity to repent. But they did not listen. They continued eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, oblivious to the disaster approaching. The Book of Enoch expands the narrative. After the archangels petitioned God and received commands to bind the Watchers and destroy the Nephilim, God addressed Noah through Uriel. Go to Noah and tell him in my name, hide yourself, and reveal to him the end that is approaching, that the whole earth will be destroyed, and a deluge is about to come upon the whole earth, and will destroy all that is on it. The warning was more than informational. It was directive. Noah needed to prepare, to build, to gather resources and animals, to make ready for the catastrophe that would soon engulf the world. Enoch himself had been given foreknowledge of the flood. God revealed through holy angels his purpose to destroy the sinful race by bringing a flood of waters upon the earth. Enoch preached this coming destruction, warning his generation that divine judgment was imminent. But like Noah after him, Enoch found few listeners. The antediluvian world continued in its corruption, dismissing warnings, ignoring prophets, convinced that the patterns of their existence would continue indefinitely. The decision was made not merely to punish but to erase. The flood would not leave survivors scattered across the globe. It would not preserve cities for later generations to rebuild. It would sweep everything away: structures, technologies, civilizations, the Nephilim and their works, the corrupted humanity that served them, and the earth itself would be cleansed through water that would cover even the highest mountains. The antediluvian world would end completely, and what came after would begin with 8 people stepping from an ark onto a washed earth. The mechanism of destruction was twofold. Genesis 7:11 describes the moment the flood began. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day all the fountains of the great deep burst open, and the windows of the heavens were opened. The date was precise, recorded down to the day, marking the moment when creation's stability dissolved into catastrophe. The fountains of the great deep broke up first. This was not merely rain. It was the eruption of subterranean water, vast reservoirs beneath the earth's surface that had existed since creation, held under pressure, now violently released. The Hebrew describes them as being cloven, torn apart, ruptured with force. Geysers of water shot upward from beneath the ground, flooding the surface from below. The great deep, referenced in Genesis 1:2 as the primordial waters over which God's Spirit hovered, had been contained beneath the dry land. Now it burst forth, unstoppable and overwhelming. The breakup was global and sustained. The fountains remained open for 150 days, continuously pouring water onto the surface. This was not a brief storm. It was a geological upheaval, a fundamental restructuring of the Earth's hydrological system. The subterranean chambers emptied their contents, flooding continents, drowning valleys, covering mountains. The violence of the eruption suggests tectonic activity, earthquakes, volcanic explosions, the splitting of the ground along fault lines that released pressurized water in catastrophic volumes. Simultaneously, the windows of heaven opened. The imagery suggests floodgates or lattices that normally held back celestial waters, now thrown wide to release torrential rain. The waters above the firmament mentioned in Genesis 1:7. A canopy or layer of water separated from the waters below during creation, may have collapsed, pouring down in quantities far exceeding normal precipitation. The rain was not ordinary. It was diluvian, a deluge that continued for 40 days and 40 nights without ceasing. The combination was lethal. Water from below and water from above converged, raising sea levels at rates no living thing could escape. The floodwaters increased steadily, covering the land, drowning populations, submerging cities. Genesis 7:19-20 records the extent. And the waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth, and all the high hills under the whole heaven were covered. The waters prevailed 15 cubits upward, and the mountains were covered. Even the highest peaks disappeared beneath the flood. Nothing on dry land survived except what was inside the ark. The ark itself was a masterpiece of engineering, designed by God to withstand conditions no ship had faced before or would face again. Its dimensions, 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high, made it massive by any standard. Using an 18-inch cubit, the ark measured approximately 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. Few wooden ships in history have approached this size, nearly 1.5 football fields in length and taller than a modern 4-story building. The volume was equally impressive. The Ark's total capacity was roughly 1.5 million cubic feet, equivalent to over 570 standard railroad stock cars. Its floor space, divided over 3 decks, totaled more than 101,000 square feet, larger than 21 standard basketball courts. This was sufficient to house representatives of every animal kind, along with food for them and Noah's family for the duration of the flood and the months that followed before the earth could sustain life again. God had given Noah time to prepare. Genesis 6:3 contains a debated statement, "My spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years." Some interpret this as limiting human lifespan to 120 years, though post-flood patriarchs lived much longer initially. A better reading sees it as a countdown, God declaring that he would tolerate humanity's wickedness for 120 more years before bringing judgment. This gave Noah time to build the ark, time for his sons to marry and mature, time for one final period of preaching righteousness to a generation that would not listen. During those 120 years, Noah worked. He felled trees, shaped planks, coated them with pitch inside and out to make the structure watertight. He constructed 3 decks, installed a window, built a door in the side. He gathered food for the animals and his family, enough to last over a year. And he preached, warning those around him that judgment was coming, that the flood would destroy everything, that they should repent while time remained. They did not believe him. 2 Peter 2:5 calls Noah a preacher of righteousness, indicating he proclaimed God's message to his generation. But Genesis 7:1 reveals the outcome. Only Noah's household entered the ark. 8 souls, no extended family, no neighbors, no converts from his decades of preaching. The antediluvian world ignored his warnings, dismissed his construction project, and continued in the patterns that would destroy them, eating, drinking, marrying, oblivious to approaching disaster. When the ark was complete, God commanded, "Come into the ark, you and all your household, because I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation." Noah obeyed. His family entered. The animals came in pairs, male and female, of every kind: birds, cattle, creeping things, clean and unclean. The loading process took 7 days. And then on the 17th day of the 2nd month, in the 600th year of Noah's life, God shut the door. No one else could enter. The boundary was sealed. Inside the ark, 8 souls and representatives of every animal kind. Outside, a world about to drown. The decree was fulfilled. God had decided not merely to punish but to erase. The watchers were bound. The Nephilim would be destroyed. Corrupted humanity would perish. The antediluvian world, its cities, technologies, civilizations, and every trace of the order the Nephilim had established, would vanish beneath waters that covered the earth. Only Noah and his family would cross the boundary between the old world and the new, carrying humanity forward through catastrophe into a cleansed creation. The rain began. The fountains erupted, and the flood, long decreed, finally fell. The waters rose. Genesis 7:21 records the outcome with stark simplicity. "And all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds and cattle and beasts and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, and every man." The language was comprehensive, leaving no ambiguity about the scope of destruction. Everything on dry land with the breath of life in its nostrils died. The flood spared nothing outside the ark. Birds perished. Livestock drowned. Wild animals were swept away. And every single human being, except the 8 souls sealed inside Noah's vessel, was destroyed. The Nephilim were included in that destruction. Despite their immense stature, despite their strength inherited from angelic fathers, despite the terror they had inspired in ordinary humans, the giants could not escape the rising waters. The flood was universal, covering even the highest mountains by 15 cubits, approximately 22 feet. No peak offered refuge. No elevation provided escape. The waters rose relentlessly, driven by the fountains of the great deep and the opened windows of heaven, until the entire surface of the earth was submerged. The texts do not describe the final moments of the Nephilim in detail. They do not record whether the giants fought the waters, climbed to mountaintops as the flood approached, or attempted to survive through their supernatural strength. But the outcome was certain. Genesis 7:23 declares, "Every living thing on the face of the earth was wiped out. People and animals and the creatures that move along the ground and the birds were wiped from the earth. Only Noah was left and those with him in the ark." The Nephilim, despite being mighty men of renown, despite their fame and power, were not exempt from the judgment that fell upon all flesh. Their size became a disadvantage. Beings whose height reached extraordinary proportions, whether 300 cubits, 3,000 ells, or some lesser but still immense stature, required more resources to sustain. They needed more air, more food, more space. As the waters rose, their greater mass made floating impossible. They sank, their strength useless against drowning. The Book of Enoch had predicted this. Gabriel had been commanded to set the Nephilim against one another, to destroy them through mutual conflict before the flood came. But even those who survived that internecine violence faced the waters that covered the earth. The cities they had built were swallowed. The megalithic structures, platforms of massive stones, walls of cyclopean blocks, towers reaching toward heaven, disappeared beneath the flood. Sediment accumulated over them, burying foundations, covering walls, erasing the visible traces of antediluvian civilization. What had stood as monuments to Nephilim dominance became tombs, submerged and forgotten, known to later generations only through fragmented myths and rare archaeological anomalies that conventional chronology could not explain. The Damascus document, found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, describes the moment poetically. The watchers of heaven fell, that's the angels, and were ensnared by it, for they did not observe the commandments of God. Their sons, the children of the angels, who were as tall as cedars and whose bodies were as big as mountains, fell by it. The imagery emphasizes scale, cedars for height, mountains for mass, and confirms their destruction. They fell, not in battle against heaven's armies, but beneath water that rose higher than their greatest stature could reach. But the bodies died while the spirits endured. This is where the Book of Enoch offers its most controversial claim. When the Nephilim's physical forms perished in the flood, their hybrid nature created a theological problem. They were not fully human, so their spirits could not descend to Sheol like mortal souls. They were not fully angelic, so they could not return to heaven or share the fate of their fathers bound in darkness. They became something else, disembodied spirits condemned to wander the earth. Enoch chapter 15 makes the claim explicit. When a Nephilim dies, its spirit roams the earth, afflicts humans, and will do so until the world ends. These wandering spirits became what later tradition called demons. The distinction is critical. Fallen angels, the watchers themselves, are bound in Tartarus, chained in darkness until final judgment. Demons, by contrast, roam freely, seeking to possess human hosts, causing affliction, leading humanity astray. The spirits of the dead Nephilim were neither fully human nor fully divine. They inherited angelic nature from their fathers but were born in mortal flesh through their mothers. When the flesh died in the flood, the angelic component, immortal, spiritual, could not simply cease. It remained disembodied, seeking what it had lost. The Book of Jubilees adds a detail. 10% of these spirits were assigned to Mastema, a figure associated with accusation and evil, to afflict humanity until the final judgment. The remaining 90% were bound or confined in some manner, though the text does not specify where or how. This framework explains phenomena the canonical texts hint at but do not develop. Why do demons in the New Testament seek to possess human bodies? Because they are disembodied Nephilim spirits desperate to regain physical form. Why do unclean spirits wander through dry places seeking rest and finding none? Because they are homeless, neither belonging to Sheol nor to heaven, condemned to restless wandering until the end. The demons Jesus confronted, the evil spirits the apostles cast out, were, according to this interpretation, the lingering remnants of the antediluvian giants, still afflicting humanity millennia after their bodies drowned. The waters did not merely cover the lowlands. Genesis 7:20 specifies, "The waters rose and covered the mountains to a depth of more than 15 cubits. The phrasing is debated. Some interpret it as 15 cubits of water above the highest mountains, others as 15 cubits being the depth sufficient to cover all peaks. Either reading confirms global inundation. Every mountain under heaven was submerged. No high ground remained. The Nephilim, even if they climbed to the tallest peaks, found no refuge. The waters rose higher than their greatest stature could reach. The duration compounded the destruction. The rain fell for 40 days and 40 nights initially, but the waters continued to prevail for 150 days total. This was not a brief storm followed by rapid recession. The flood maintained its maximum depth for 5 months, ensuring nothing survived, allowing no escape, giving the waters time to reshape the Earth's surface completely. The fountains of the great deep remained open. The pressure from below and precipitation from above sustained water levels that drowned every terrestrial ecosystem. The Nephilim's strength was useless. Their immense size required more oxygen, more energy, more resources. Drowning would come faster for beings whose metabolic demands exceeded human norms. And unlike animals that entered the ark in pairs, the Nephilim had no provision for salvation. God had not commanded Noah to preserve them. They were abominations, hybrids born of transgression, beings whose very existence violated the created order. Their destruction was not collateral damage. It was intentional, necessary, part of the cleansing the flood was designed to accomplish. Their cities vanished beneath sediment. The violence of the flood, water bursting from underground, torrential rain from above, tectonic upheaval as the Earth's crust adjusted to catastrophic forces, would have buried structures under layers of mud and debris. Archaeological evidence shows how quickly cities can disappear. The Greek cities of eastern Canopus and Heracleion, built at the mouth of the Nile, were swallowed by mud and now lie under 5 to 7 meters of sediment offshore. A combination of earthquakes, flooding, and subsidence caused their disappearance. If historical floods could bury entire cities in meters of mud, a global deluge of the magnitude Genesis describes would have obliterated surface structures completely. Pre-flood artifacts would be rare or non-existent in the fossil record for multiple reasons. The highest terrains, where antediluvian populations likely concentrated as waters rose, were wiped clean, with even soil and surface rock layers removed by backwashing as floodwaters receded. Lower elevation deposits contain marine fossils from the earliest stages of the flood, before terrestrial life was reached. By the time human habitations were inundated, the violence and duration of the flood ensured organic materials decomposed, and structures were pulverized or buried beyond recognition. The Nephilim's bodies would have faced similar fates. Flesh decomposes rapidly, especially in water saturated with sediment and organic matter. Bones of immense size, if they survived intact, might be mistaken for other phenomena or remain buried in locations unexplored by modern archaeology. The flood's violence, churning waters, collapsing landscapes, rapid sedimentation, would scatter remains, crush bones, bury fragments under layers impossible to excavate comprehensively. What evidence survived likely lies beneath oceans, under mountain ranges uplifted during post-flood tectonic adjustments, or in sedimentary layers misidentified by conventional geology that does not account for a global deluge. But the spirits endured. This is the claim Enoch makes that Genesis does not address. The bodies died, the flesh drowned, but the spiritual component, neither fully angelic nor fully human, could not simply cease. It wandered, disembodied, seeking hosts, causing affliction, continuing in death the destruction begun in life. The demons that plague humanity throughout biblical history and into the present, according to this framework, are the Nephilim's ghosts, spirits of giants who drowned millennia ago but never found rest. The text offers fragments, not certainty. Genesis confirms that all flesh died, that only Noah and those in the ark survived. The Book of Enoch adds that Nephilim spirits became wandering demons. The Book of Jubilees specifies that 10% were assigned to Mastema for afflicting humanity. Later Jewish tradition and early Christian interpretation accepted this framework, explaining the origin of demons as distinct from fallen angels. But the canonical scriptures remain silent on the details, leaving room for interpretation, but not demanding acceptance of extra-biblical accounts. What remains certain is the comprehensive nature of the destruction. The Nephilim did not survive. Their strength did not save them. Their stature did not allow escape. The waters rose higher than their greatest height. The flood prevailed longer than their endurance could last. And when the waters receded, their bodies were gone, drowned, decayed, buried beneath sediment that hardened into rock over centuries. Their cities vanished. Their works were erased. The world they had dominated was cleansed, reset, prepared for a new beginning under Noah's descendants. The giants were destroyed. Whether their spirits wandered as demons or perished completely, the texts leave ambiguous. But their bodies drowned, their reign ended, and the antediluvian order they represented was obliterated. The flood accomplished what it was decreed to do, not merely punish wickedness but erase it, removing the Nephilim and the corrupted world they inhabited, leaving only the ark and its 8 human souls to carry creation forward into a world washed clean. The waters receded slowly. Genesis 8:1 marks the turning point. But God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and the livestock that were with him in the ark, and he sent a wind over the earth, and the waters receded. The language is tender, God remembered. Not that he had forgotten, but that the appointed time arrived for mercy to manifest. A wind blew across the submerged planet, accelerating evaporation, driving waters toward the poles and ocean basins, exposing land that had been drowned for months. The fountains of the deep closed, the windows of heaven shut, the mechanisms that had sustained the deluge ceased operating, rain stopped falling. The underground reservoirs that had burst open sealed themselves, perhaps through tectonic shifts or divine intervention revering what judgment had begun. The waters receded steadily, day by day, revealing a world transformed beyond recognition. After 150 days, 5 months from the flood's beginning, the waters had decreased enough that the ark came to rest. Genesis 8:4 specifies the location and date. On the 17th day of the 7th month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. The landing was not violent. The massive vessel, divinely designed, settled gently onto peaks that had only recently emerged from beneath the flood. The plural mountains of Ararat suggests a range, not a single peak, located in what is now eastern Turkey. For months more, the waters continued receding. Not until the 10th month did the tops of mountains become visible elsewhere. Noah and his family remained inside the ark, waiting for God's command to emerge. They could see through the window that land existed, that peaks broke through the water's surface, but they did not presume to leave. The door had been shut by God. It would open by God's timing, not theirs. When Noah finally stepped from the ark, over a year after entering it, he encountered silence. The world was emptied. Every city that had stood was buried or obliterated. Every population center that had thrived lay drowned beneath sediment. The Nephilim were gone. The humans who had served them, worshipped false gods, filled the earth with violence. All perished. Only 8 souls remained, standing on a mountain in a world scoured clean but utterly desolate. Noah's first act was worship. Genesis 8:20 records. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took some of every clean animal and some of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. This was the first altar mentioned in Scripture, the first recorded sacrifice after the flood. Noah offered clean animals, those God had commanded him to bring in groups of 7 pairs specifically for this purpose. The burnt offering represented complete surrender, total dedication, acknowledgement that God was sovereign over the universe and had shown both wrath and redemption. The aroma pleased God. Genesis 8:21 states, "And when the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I ever again strike down every living creature as I have done." The promise was categorical. Despite acknowledging that humanity's heart remained inclined toward evil, the flood had not changed human nature. God pledged never again to destroy all life through such catastrophe. The covenant included guarantees about natural cycles. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. The regularity of seasons, the predictability of agricultural rhythms, the stability of day and night, all were promised to continue without interruption. This was foundational for rebuilding civilization. Noah's descendants could plant crops knowing harvest would come, could plan for winter knowing summer would follow, could trust that the earth would sustain life rather than destroy it. God blessed Noah and his sons. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The command echoed what he had spoken to Adam in Eden. Humanity was starting over, reduced to 3 reproducing couples, Shem and his wife, Ham and his wife, Japheth and his wife. From these 6, plus Noah and his wife who were beyond childbearing age, the entire post-flood population would emerge. The mathematical feasibility has been questioned, but demographic analysis shows it was entirely possible. Post-flood lifespans remained long initially. Shem lived 600 years, Arphaxad 438 years. Large families were the norm in agrarian societies. Multiple generations overlapped, accelerating population growth. Within centuries, millions could descend from 8 people, and within millennia, billions. Today's population of over 8 billion humans traces back to those 8 survivors, meaning each passenger on the ark is now represented by approximately 1 billion descendants. But what remained of the old world? Physically, almost nothing. The violence of the flood, tectonic upheaval, torrential rain, surging waters, had buried cities under sediment, pulverized structures, scattered debris across continents. Organic materials decomposed, wood rotted, metals corroded. Only the most massive megalithic stones, if they survived at all, lay buried beneath layers of sediment that would harden into rock over centuries. Yet knowledge survived. Noah and his family carried memories, not merely of the flood itself, but of the world that preceded it. They had lived in antediluvian civilization, witnessed its technologies, learned its crafts. Noah himself was 600 years old when the flood came, meaning he had observed centuries of cultural development, accumulated wisdom, mastered skills. His sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, were mature men, married, capable of building and maintaining complex systems. The knowledge they preserved included metallurgy. Genesis 4:22 records that Tubal-Cain before the flood was the forger of all implements of bronze and iron. This sophisticated technology did not disappear. Noah's family remembered how to work metals, how to extract ore, how to forge tools and weapons. After the flood, metalworking reappeared quickly in archaeological records, suggesting continuity of knowledge rather than rediscovery through trial and error. Shipbuilding expertise passed forward. The ark itself demonstrated advanced engineering, 300 cubits long, 50 wide, 30 high, perfectly proportioned to remain stable in violent seas. Noah built this vessel following God's specifications, but the execution required skill, planning, and understanding of construction principles. That knowledge remained with his descendants, enabling them to build boats, bridges, and structures as they spread across the post-flood world. Masonry and architecture survived as well. The Tower of Babel, built within generations of the flood, demonstrated sophisticated construction techniques. Genesis 11:3-4 describes the builders saying, "Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly." And they used brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens." This was not primitive construction. It involved standardized materials, coordinated labor, engineering calculations to achieve extreme height. Some scholars suggest the Tower of Babel was intended as protection against another flood, a water-safe structure tall enough to rise above any future deluge. Josephus records that Nimrod, the tower's chief architect, sought to avenge himself on God for destroying their forefathers by building something God's judgment could not reach. The motive was defiance, the method was sophisticated engineering, and the knowledge required traced back to pre-flood civilizations whose techniques Noah's family had preserved. The megaliths scattered across the globe may represent another form of knowledge transmission. The methods required to quarry, transport, and position stones weighing hundreds of tons did not emerge spontaneously in post-flood societies. They required expertise passed down from earlier generations, possibly from antediluvian civilizations that had built on similar scales. Noah and his sons, familiar with pre-flood construction, could have taught their descendants techniques that later cultures refined and adapted to local conditions. Pottery styles emerging in post-flood settlements show both continuity and variation. Archaeological evidence from the Near East reveals pottery traditions, Halaf, Ubaid, Samarra, that appear contemporaneously rather than sequentially, suggesting multiple family lines preserving distinct methods learned before the flood but adapted after dispersal. The sophistication appears immediately, without the gradual development conventional archaeology expects. This fits a model where knowledge survived intact through Noah's family rather than being rediscovered slowly over millennia. Cultural memories persisted beyond the biblical account. Mesopotamian flood myths, preserved in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Eridu Genesis, and the Atrahasis epic, describe catastrophic deluges, divine judgment, and lone survivors who preserved humanity. The details differ from Genesis, but the core elements remain. Gods regret creation, send flood, one man builds boat, life continues through his family. These are not independent myths but distorted memories of the same event, passed down through Noah's descendants as they scattered and developed separate cultures. Similar flood myths appear globally among the Aztecs, Native American tribes, Asian civilizations, Pacific Islanders. The consistency suggests common origin. Every culture remembers a time when waters covered the earth, when divine judgment fell, when a remnant survived to restart civilization. The memories fragmented as languages separated at Babel, but the core narrative persisted, testimony to an event so catastrophic it could not be forgotten despite millennia of cultural drift. Yet Genesis moves quickly past the immediate aftermath. It records Noah's sacrifice, God's covenant, the blessing to multiply and fill the earth. Then it leaps forward, tracing genealogies, nodding lifespans, documenting the spread of populations across continents. The silence, the emptiness Noah encountered when stepping from the ark, receives no extended description. The text assumes it, acknowledges it implicitly, but does not dwell on the emotional or psychological weight of being the last 8 humans alive on a planet recently drowned. Other traditions linger on that silence. Jewish midrash imagines Noah weeping at the desolation, planting vineyards to cope with grief, struggling with the enormity of being tasked with repopulating an empty world. Apocryphal texts describe his descendants exploring ruins, finding fragments of antediluvian cities buried under sediment, wondering at the scale of what had been lost. The canonical text offers none of this, but the absence itself speaks, a void where thriving civilizations once stood, a silence where voices once filled the earth. What remained was memory. What was buried was almost everything else. The old knowledge survived in fragments: metallurgy, construction, agriculture, astronomy, carried forward by 8 people who remembered a world destroyed for corruption they had witnessed but not joined. The silence after the waters was profound, comprehensive, the sound of a planet reset. And from that silence, slowly, humanity would begin again. The question arises immediately when Israel approaches the Promised Land. Numbers 13:33 records the report of the spies sent to scout Canaan. "We saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." The statement is jarring. The Nephilim had drowned in the flood. All flesh outside the ark perished. Yet here, centuries after the waters receded, the spies encounter giants and identify them using the same term Genesis applied to the antediluvian hybrids. The Anakim were real. They were not metaphorical, not exaggerated fears of intimidated scouts. Multiple biblical texts confirm their existence. Deuteronomy 1:28 records the people's complaint. "The people are stronger and taller than we are. The cities are large, with walls up to the sky. We even saw the Anakites there." Joshua 11:21-22 describes their defeat. "Joshua went and destroyed the Anakites from the hill country." No Anakites were left in Israelite territory. Only in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod did any survive. These were beings of extraordinary height, dwelling in fortified cities, requiring military campaigns to subdue. The connection to the pre-flood Nephilim remains debated. Some scholars suggest the spies used Nephilim loosely, referring to any giants rather than claiming direct lineage from the antediluvian hybrids. The word Nephilim means fallen ones, or those who cause others to fall, and could apply descriptively to any intimidating warriors. By this reading, the Anakim were simply very tall humans, perhaps 9 feet or more, whose size terrified the Israelites but who bore no genetic connection to the angel's offspring. Others argue the text implies genuine continuity. Numbers 13:33 explicitly states, "The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim," suggesting not metaphorical resemblance but actual ancestry. If true, this raises an uncomfortable question. How did Nephilim genetics survive the flood when all flesh outside the ark was destroyed? The Bible offers no explicit answer, leaving interpreters to propose theories based on fragmentary evidence. One theory suggests genetic contamination survived through Noah's daughters-in-law. The text states Noah was perfect in his generations, implying his bloodline remained uncorrupted. But his sons' wives are not described with the same language. If one or more carried Nephilim genetics, perhaps diluted enough not to manifest visibly but present in their DNA, those genes could have passed to their children and eventually expressed in later generations. This would explain post-flood giants without requiring a second angelic incursion. The theory has problems. It seems unlikely God would preserve contaminated genetics through the ark, defeating the purpose of the flood's cleansing judgment. Yet the text never explicitly states the wives were genetically pure, and the reappearance of giants demands some explanation. If the contamination was recessive, hidden, it might have survived unnoticed until later generations when the right genetic combinations produced offspring of unusual size. A second theory proposes a second incursion, another descent of angels after the flood, repeating the transgression of the watchers. Genesis 6:4 contains a cryptic phrase, "The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them." The phrase "and also afterward" suggests the phenomenon occurred both before and after the flood. If angels descended again post-flood, mingling with human women, this would produce new generations of Nephilim genetically similar to the originals. This theory faces theological objections. Why would God allow a second incursion after destroying the world precisely to eliminate the hybrid offspring of the first? Yet the watchers had been warned and bound before the flood. Perhaps a different group of angels, learning of God's covenant never again to flood the earth, believed they could repeat the transgression without facing the same judgment. They were wrong. God's response was conquest and extermination through Israel rather than global deluge, but the attempt might have been made. Daniel 2:41-43 hints at ongoing attempts to mingle seed. The prophet describes the final kingdom, the feet of iron and clay, as mixing with one another in marriage, but they will not hold together, just as iron does not mix with clay. Some interpret this as angelic beings attempting to corrupt human genetics in the last days, echoing what occurred before the flood. The passage is cryptic, but it suggests the mingling of incompatible essences, something that should not hold together but is attempted nonetheless. Og, king of Bashan, provides the clearest biblical evidence of post-flood giants. Deuteronomy 3:11 records, Og, king of Bashan, was the last of the Rephaites. His bed was made of iron and was more than 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide. It is still in Rabbah of the Ammonites. Using an 18-inch cubit, the bed measured approximately 13.5 feet long and 6 feet wide. This was not symbolic. It was a physical object preserved in Rabbah for public viewing, evidence that its owner was of extraordinary size. The bed's dimensions suggest Og stood over 12 feet tall, possibly 13 or 14 feet depending on how much additional length was built into the bed. This was not tall for his time. This was giant by any standard, approaching the lower estimates given for antediluvian Nephilim. Og was called the last of the Rephaim, a clan associated with giants throughout the Old Testament. His defeat by Israel marked the end of a lineage, but it confirmed that beings of immense stature existed centuries after the flood. Goliath provides the most famous example. The Philistine champion who faced David stood 6 cubits and a span, according to the Hebrew Masoretic text. Using an 18-inch cubit and 9-inch span, this places Goliath at 9 feet 9 inches tall. Some ancient manuscripts, including the Septuagint and certain Dead Sea Scroll fragments, give a lower height, 4 cubits and a span, or approximately 6 feet 9 inches. Scholars debate which reading is original, whether the taller figure was an exaggeration or the shorter figure a later correction. Either height is exceptional. A man nearly 10 feet tall would dominate any battlefield. Even at 6 feet 9 inches, Goliath would tower over opponents in an era when average male height was significantly less than today. The biblical account describes him wearing bronze armor weighing 125 pounds, carrying a spear whose iron point alone weighed 15 pounds. The scale fits a warrior of immense stature and strength, a throwback to earlier ages when giants walked the earth. Goliath came from Gath, one of 3 Philistine cities where Anakim survived after Joshua's conquest. Joshua 11:21-22 records that Joshua destroyed the Anakim from the hill country. No Anakites were left in Israelite territory, Only in Gaza, Gath and Ashdod did any survive. Gath became a refuge for giants, preserving bloodlines that elsewhere had been exterminated. When Goliath challenged Israel centuries later, he represented the continuation of clans that should have been destroyed in the conquest. The Rephaim were another giant clan connected to the Anakim. Deuteronomy 2:10-11 explains, "The Emites had lived there formerly, a people great and many and tall as the Anakim. Like the Anakim, they are also counted as Rephaim." The term Rephaim encompassed multiple giant clans, Anakim, Emim, Zamzumim, all linked by extraordinary height and strength. They inhabited regions east of the Jordan and throughout Canaan before Israel's arrival. Og was identified as one of the last Rephaim, but the designation last meant he was among the final of a dying breed, not that no others existed. Descendants of Raphael, a giant whose name became synonymous with the Rephaim, continued fighting Israel during David's reign. 2 Samuel 21:16-22 lists 4 giants killed by David's men, all described as descendants of Raphael and Gath. One of them had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, a genetic anomaly suggesting hybridization or mutation consistent with Nephilim ancestry. The conquest under Joshua was explicitly tasked with destroying these giants. Joshua 11:21 states, "At that time Joshua went and destroyed the Anakim from the mountains, from Hebron, Debir, Anab, from all the mountains of Judah, and from all the mountains of Israel. Joshua utterly destroyed them with their cities." The Hebrew term for utterly destroyed is cherem, devoted to destruction, total annihilation, leaving nothing alive. This was not merely conquest but extermination, targeted specifically at the giant clans. Why would God command genocide against the Anakim? The most coherent explanation ties back to Genesis 6. If the Anakim carried Nephilim genetics, their existence represented ongoing contamination of the human genome. The flood had cleansed the earth of such hybrids. Their reappearance, whether through recessive genes or a second incursion, required surgical removal to prevent the corruption from spreading again. Israel became the instrument of divine judgment against beings whose existence threatened the purity of the human race. The conquest was incomplete. Joshua destroyed most of the Anakim, but some survived in Philistine territory. David and his men finished what Joshua began, hunting down the remaining giants during David's reign. By the time of Solomon, no more giants are mentioned in biblical text. The clans that had terrorized Israel during the conquest era were extinct, their bloodlines eliminated through centuries of targeted warfare. Yet echoes persisted. The biblical record preserves their names: Nephilim, Anakim, Rephaim, Emim, Zamzumim, each associated with extraordinary height, strength, and capacity for violence. Cultural memory retains stories of these beings long after their physical extinction. Jewish tradition, Greek mythology, and folklore across cultures remember giants who once ruled, terrorized, and eventually fell before smaller but more numerous human populations. The question haunts the text: if all flesh was destroyed in the flood, why do giants appear again? Genesis 6:4 offers a cryptic clue. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward. The phrase "and also afterward" could mean post-flood, suggesting the phenomenon recurred. Or it could be a parenthetical note, explaining that the mighty men of renown existed both in primordial times and in the later period just before the flood. The grammar permits either reading. The Bible does not provide a single definitive answer. It acknowledges giants existed before the flood and appeared again afterward. It records their destruction through conquest. It preserves measurements of their beds, descriptions of their cities, genealogies linking them to specific clans. But it does not explain how the genetics survived or whether a second incursion occurred. The texts offer fragments, theories, possibilities, but not certainty. What remains clear is that something survived. Whether through contaminated genetics carried unknowingly through the ark, or through a second angelic transgression after the flood, or through some mechanism the texts do not reveal, beings of immense stature reappeared in post-flood history. They built cities. They ruled kingdoms. They challenged Israel. And they were destroyed systematically until none remained. The echoes faded. The giants vanished. But the memory endured, testimony to a time when the boundary between human and divine dissolved, producing offspring who should never have existed and whose extermination required divine intervention spanning millennia.